If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
For hunters, hikers, and campers, what is the scariest paranormal, strange, or creepy thing you've encountered deep in the woods, forests, or trails?
At the time, my boyfriend and I decided to go camping with his parents. They were in a camper, while I and my boyfriend were staying in his Jeep. We were camping on his family's property, so there was no one from the public there at all. We had been fighting, and I decided to hop out of the Jeep to blow off some steam. I had a lantern with me and went in the woods. I heard the car door open and close, so me being me, I shut my lantern off so he couldn't find me. I heard the car door shut and close again. Instead of coming to find me, he decided to get back into the car because he said he had a sick feeling in his stomach and decided it would be a bad idea to leave the car. Great boyfriend, I know. Anyways, as I am sitting in the dark woods, very upset, I see a black figure. Figuring it's my boyfriend, I yell at him, "Get up," without turning my lantern on, and storm off past the figure. I get back to the car, and as I open the door, my boyfriend is sitting there. I ask if he was out there, and he explains to me that he stayed in the car because he felt weird leaving. The figure did not resemble his mother or father. Whoever that was, I'm glad I never met you or saw your face. This happened last night. I live in rural Washington state in a town called Marble Mount. I'm an avid hunter, and we're currently in season, so I was putting some trap cameras out on my property, roughly 200 acres. I was walking to the third to last camera spot when I noticed that everything had gone silent, not a peep. It seemed as if the whole world had just frozen over, even the creek sounded muffled. I stopped and listened for what felt like an hour or so, and then I heard a voice coming from a dark part of the trail behind me. Not just any voice though, my wife's, but it was twisted and chilling. It said, "Do you need help, honey? Would you like my help?" And I knew it was wrong. I looked in the direction of where it was coming from, but all I could see was a massive outline of a creature standing on what looked to be two legs, so I turned my flashlight towards it and immediately turned it off. I've never seen anything like it. It had the head of an elk and the arms of a demon with long black claws and white teeth that almost glowed when hit by the light. It was bone thin, but muscular in an almost distorted way. I sat in the middle of the trail praying when I could feel its breath on my neck, but it wasn't warm, it was ice cold. I just stood there silent and prayed. I prayed that I'd make it back to my wife, that I'd survive, but then it just walked away. As quickly as it came, the silence stopped. It was as if death itself had left the woods. I never have believed in anything of that nature, and needless to say, hunting was cancelled. I'm currently in the den of my home looking for answers as to what it is. I saw a friend of mine tell me to share or whatever there is now and see if anyone knows. So please comment if you even have the slightest idea. I'm a young man. 21 this year, and my story happened when I was 15. I used to live in a rural area in Oklahoma. We lived in a valley with forest all around us, basically cutting us off from any other outside cities around the valley. Besides an opening into the rest of the plains, the valley was a horseshoe shape. Anyway, I witnessed this creature on October 8, 2004. It was a few days after the start of bow season, and I had finally gotten some time to get in my grandfather's 900 acres. It was early in the morning, around 4:30, and I drove to my location. I walked down the man-made trail to my spot, where I would sit under a tree and watch the feeder in the field on the south side of the property. I got comfortable and sat there and got my mind ready to wait. I just sat in the darkness of the forest and would hear an occasional cow or coyote. Then suddenly there was movement coming from the other side of the forest, and a group of cows and their calves came through and started to graze in the field. There goes my chance of seeing anything, I thought. About 15 minutes later, watching the cows graze and the calves sucking on the mother's udders, one of the cows raised its head fast and at attention in the direction of the tree line on the side of the forest next to us. The cow suddenly trotted off fast in the other direction, and the rest of them joined her, moving away from the field. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, so that's how I saw this happen, and the moonlight helped as well. I watched the forest tree line for a few seconds and didn't really think about it, until suddenly I heard movement and snapping of branches. Then I saw a large, and I mean large, as in the fingers were as long as my forearm and hand grasped the tree, and I noticed something emerge out of the forest. It was huge, like from my thought it looked to be 21 or 23 feet tall. Its arms were maybe the width of my own, maybe less. The arms were long, very long, it looked like stilts, to be honest, and it moved majestically, like an ape. Its head came through the leaves, and my heart dropped. Its face was long, and its mouth was similar to the scream mask. It had no nose, just slits like a snake, and its eyes were like humans' eyes, but they glowed when it looked around like dogs' eyes. Its feet were long, and it had a distinctive look to it, like a rabbit's leg or someone walking on the balls of their feet. It walked or crawled into the field, it stopped and squatted down to look at something. At this point, it was maybe 50 feet away from me, but I knew it couldn't see me. I was wearing a heavy winter camo with no orange. Just when I had that thought, it looked in my general direction. It blinks and stands slowly, its eyes still around me. It moved forward. I just stayed still, and eventually, after what felt like an eternity of watching me, it turned and all fours walked away. I've never seen it again, and I found out through some digging online that I could tell my story here. I was 13 at the time, and I was at my stepdad's house. It's in a heavily wooded area. I just got done hunting for the first time with him. It was around 4:30 p.m. in the fall, so the sun was just barely above the horizon. I just got done hanging the deer so we can butcher it first thing in the morning and washing off the knife with the hose in the garage. When I was about to close the side door, I heard a twig snap to my right, so I looked over. There was this thing. It had white fur and dark blue eyes poking out from behind a tree. I froze and locked eyes with it when I tried to back up, and when it came, I nearly pissed myself. It stood about 6 feet tall and walked on 2 legs. While I was backing up, I tripped over a root sticking out of the ground as I fell. It charged at me. I tried to get up, but my pants were stuck, so at the time I only thought, die fighting. So I grabbed my 10-inch hunting knife, and when I turned it, it was gone. All I heard was growling and leaves crunching, so I cut my pants free, booked it in, locked the door, grabbed my .44 Magnum carbine, loaded it, and waited behind the couch for my stepdad. Later that night, after telling him everything that went down, he just laughed and told me, "Yeah, sure thing, bud," but as soon as he said that we heard a howl, it sounded close, and he went white. And let's just say we didn't sleep, we kept our guns loaded and ready to take him out. I still go to the woods, but with that old .44 Magnum carbine and a machete, never at dusk. In early April, my father and I decided to ride dirt bikes in Irwin, Tennessee. We parked at my aunt's house, which is a mile or so from the location, Rock Creek Mountain Trails. We took off earlier in the day, around 11 or so, and took off with no problems. We had fun shooting around turns and speeding through the woods. We went all over the side and top of the mountain. Since the coronavirus started, all parks were closed, and this was no exception, so we were weary of the park rangers in service, so we kept a close eye out for rangers. At any rate, whilst riding the bikes were in check and fully working order, so it was odd when we decided to drop off the back of the mountain into a small flat where my dad used to camp and ride with his friends. As soon as we started the descent off of the mountain and into the flat, my bike started to act up. My bike is a TTR 250 and has no kickstart, so it just has electric start. So, we stopped for a minute to look at everything to see if maybe something was stuck in the chain, but it was fine. So we started the bike and started the descent further into the woods. We journeyed maybe a quarter of a mile into the flat. As soon as we passed another hairpin turning into the flat, my dad stopped to talk about where he and his friends used to camp and the crazy things that happened. He got done talking, and we decided to head deeper into the woods. My dad started his bike and took off, leaving me in the turn. I flipped the key in on/off switch on and tried to start it, nothing. I fiddled with it for a few more minutes, trying to start it by flipping the key in on/off switch, but still nothing. I yelled for my dad and kept trying the key. By the grace of God, he noticed I was taking a long time and came back to help. I kept trying while he came from the opposite direction and still nothing. As soon as my dad came for help, it decided to turn on. I thought maybe the battery cable is loose and I'll have to tighten it at home. We took off down the trail with no problems. We had made it to a part of the trail that continued on, but a tree had fallen over and there was no chance of moving it, so we turned around. That's when things got odd. My dad took off again, and I started up without a problem and took off too. My dad was further ahead than I was, so I tried to catch up. This trail was very rocky and curvy, so visibility was not very good. On one of the curves, I saw my dad. But he wasn't on his bike. He was standing in the woods 5 or so feet beside the trail. I slowed down because I thought that maybe he had stopped. I saw his helmet and orange shirt that he was wearing, and I kicked down into first and pulled my clutch. I saw him waving at me, ushering me to him. As soon as I did, I heard his bike in the distance. The scream of a two-stroke. At that moment I kicked my bike into gear as I heard the sound and hauled ass. I took off to catch up to my dad in the hairpin turn. I turned around to see this creature crawling after me. I went even faster until I couldn't see it. I got halfway to where the turn was, and my dad was pulled off to the side of the road. I looked back and couldn't see it. I pulled beside my dad, turned my bike off, and told him what I had seen. He was creeped out, to say the least. My dad is a big man at 6 feet 5 inches and doesn't scare easily. But he thought it may have been a ranger or something. I didn't care. I just wanted to keep riding and go to another area. I tried to start my bike, but nothing. I did the routine I had pulled earlier and still nothing. The whole situation was disturbing, and I just wanted to leave. I prayed a little prayer, and a few seconds later the bike cut on. We pulled out of there going fairly fast and to another location. After we had left that area, my bike had no problems whatsoever. Every time I pressed the start button, it sparked to life. The rest of the ride was anticlimactic. We just rode and had some fun, enjoying the day. We left at 2 or so and went back to my aunt's. We cleaned my bike and then took the seat off to inspect if the battery cable was loose. I took the plastics off the side to get to the battery. It was totally fine. I'm not sure what I saw crawling after me, and I'm not certain of why it looked my dad. My guess is that it was trying to lure me into the woods for some malicious reason. I can never be sure. All I know is I don't want to see this thing ever again. I'd rather ride my bike in peace. This happened a few years ago when I was mountain walking. We started as a large group, but after some time of everyone choosing their own pace, I ended up walking by myself. When I was walking downhill through a thick forest area, I slipped on an unstable part of the trail, and I slid on my butt to where the path goes straight. Before I could get up, a deer walked out of the trees on my left and stood in front of me. This was not natural because deer usually avoid human contact. Something was really off about this deer, and I wasn't sure what. Its eyes looked lifeless, and its aura was that of uneasiness. Then it opened its mouth to show multiple rows of what looked to be razor-sharp teeth and made an ear-shattering scream. It sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. It sounded unreal, like it shouldn't exist. I watch quite a lot of horror movies, and I'm yet to come across a scream so demonic. After the scream ended, it just closed its jaw and walked away to the other side of the woods. I never told this story to anyone before. I've heard of stories other mountain walkers talked about and how everyone that does gets labeled insane, so I kept it to myself. But I know what I saw. Hell, I can't forget no matter how much I try, and it still gives me shivers to this day. Back in 2012, I was at an Aboriginal camp in Wallumbee, NSW. I had been there for 5 years prior to this experience, and this was my last year there. We had heard stories of these creatures called the hairy man, aka Yowies. From my best recollection, they told us that they were short, had 6 fingers, and were completely covered in hair. However, one thing I had not remembered hearing was that they are said to take children through solid objects, never to be seen again. I was told this from my cousin when retelling him this story. Well, behind the camp, up a short trail, there is a cave where we could see where one, or a few, I can't recall, had put its handprint in ochre among other normal handprints. You could clearly tell by the structure of this handprint that it had not been altered, as it was a perfect hand, only with 1 extra finger. Throughout my prior 5 years at this camp during the first night, we would be told the story of the hairy man, then they would take the bravest of the kids up to this cave and spend a few minutes in it, either alone or with a friend. I would go up during this time period, however, never alone. Then, in my last year, 2012, I decided that I wanted to get over my fear. I was sitting in the cave near the back wall with only a slight gap and a bit from the entrance with my friend and a new kid. They were about to leave, and I told them then that I was staying to get over my fear. No more than 20 seconds later, I felt a hand rest on my back. There was warmth and pressure, so I was certain it was a hand. I could clearly see the entrance and knew no one else was with me. I froze up instantly, with a chill running down my back. What seemed like forever had passed, but it was likely no more than the 20 to 40 seconds until my ex appeared in the cave. Still feeling the hand on my back, I bawled my eyes out and demanded he get a teacher/elder. I got out of the cave safely but was visibly shook. I was always skeptical of the stories, but that night I knew they existed. It wasn't until my cousin told me about them taking kids that I realized that I was incredibly lucky that night to make it out of there. If it wasn't for my ex entering when he did, I'm positive I would have been taken. This wasn't the only bizarre thing I encountered in that cave, but the only one that was an urban legend. I'm hiking the Appalachian Trail in the south. I am unsure of the exact location. It was after Georgia, northbound but still southern parts of Virginia. I tried conducting some research, but all I could find was information about the Bell Witch, which is located on the opposite side of the state. So, I'm hiking with my friend Centaur. It's a clear day with no signs of rain. Nothing but blue skies. We're pretty far from any town, or even a road, for that matter. The forest is clear of underbrush and nothing but bare trees. We could easily see beyond 400 yards. About 200 yards up on the hill, we both saw a brunette woman gazing off in the distance, not looking towards us. This is extremely odd for this terrain, so my pal and myself called out to her, "Hey ma'am, are you lost?" The woman keeps her torso still and jerks her head towards us. The speed and angle of her head turn should have broken her neck. She let out a sharp, ear-piercing scream. She sounded akin to a banshee from ancient legends. We ran as fast as we could with 40-pound packs on our backs. As we are running away, the wind picks up heavily. Nearly hurricane levels. Branches are snapping, and we even heard a tree fall in the distance. The rain started pouring. Sideways rain, strong wind. I know the weather can change like a dime in the mountains, but this just felt different. We were, cold. The temperature dropped from over 80 degrees to almost 60 degrees with a steady wind chill. The rain also caught other hikers off guard. They were as confused as we were. We couldn't tell them what we saw. We couldn't even explain it to each other. We never mentioned it again. We both knew we had seen her. We continued on the trail, and I really want to find out if there is a story about her. I tried to do the research, but I'm hoping you folks could help out. Any information would help. I live in Massachusetts. In a town within the Bridgewater Triangle. There is a lot of folklore about things that dwell in the forests within the triangle. Pukwudgies are little people that once lived among the Wampanoag Native Americans that once called the area home. They're described as short shape-shifting pranksters, usually around 2 to 4 feet tall, that mess with people who enter the forest at certain times and have features of dog-like goblins, typically with bright red eyes. It is said that when you lock eyes with the creature, you are cursed, and it will follow you and taunt you. I worked maintenance with an older man who was seeing a woman who was part Native American. One day I went by his house, and we all sat at his table smoking and talking. The forest was brought up, and we began sharing stories. She was a tough woman with a no-bullshit personality. She worked the paper route, delivering newspapers, so she would have to be out around 2:30 a.m. Halfway through her shift, she pulled up to a house that she always pulls up to, with the same giant pine tree in the front yard off to the side near the wood line. She said that when she looked up, she glanced at the tree. However, when she looked, she noticed something standing next to it. It was a short creature. She described it as having the legs of a kangaroo and the face of a wolf with red, glowing eyes. Now, usually, if I were to hear this story from anyone, I would probably laugh and not believe it. But there was something in the way she said it, her facial expression, and the way she swore to me that she saw this creature. Not to mention her serious personality. I told her I believed her, and I really did. I found my hairs raising on my arms and behind my neck. I was spooked. Fast forward 6 or 7 months. I'm at the coffee shop my girlfriend works at. I was having a conversation with a few of the regulars, a couple of old men in their 70s that visit daily and talk among each other while enjoying some coffee. We were talking about hunting, and the forest was brought up. The man became serious and told me to make sure I'm armed when I go in there. I asked if he had any experiences in the forest. He had many and shared a few hair-raising stories. But there was one that stuck out and made me feel sick. He said a few weeks back he was heading to Maine to meet up with a friend for hunting. He was on the highway that runs along the forest early in the morning before the sun came up. He told me he saw 2 small creatures run across the highway. The first was going too fast, but he caught a glimpse of the second one. He said it had short arms and feet like Jack Rabbit, with hair sticking up on its back. And last second it turned and looked at him. It had a dog-like face, and its eyes reflected a bright red. I was in shock. I believed the Native American woman before, but this really solidified it for me. I shared the story with him, and he wasn't surprised. He just warned me to be careful whenever I go in there. I do a lot of week-long trips throughout Arizona. Just pick a remote location and walk for 20 to 30 miles and explore everything I can. I was south-southwest of the Mazet Salls when I unpacked my gear and was setting up camp on top of this ledge overlooking this pretty wide valley. I started a little fire that started smoking and decided to take a quick piss of this ledge. As I'm midstreaming looking out over this valley, I look over to my right and I see a ducking Mad Max looking hill with eyes, mother ducker, taking a piss off the same ledge, looking in the same direction over the valley, about 75 feet away. He looks over, acts surprised, "Oh, hey, I didn't see you there," and decides to walk over to introduce himself as homeless. I fed him some rice and beans. He talked about God and some sort of giant bones he was looking for from the original humanoid giants or something like that. There was something wrong with him, but I was scared to dismiss him from my sight or hurt his feelings. I didn't get any sleep that night and have never slept with my handgun inside my sleeping bag since. I've had bears, moose, and horses, but honestly, nothing spooked me out more than hiking in the mountains of Japan at night. Forgotten or abandoned shrines would just appear on my field of view from my headlamp, and the little shrine bells would echo around me. Trails in Japan are either concrete stairs and very looked after or just barely a footpath. I took to hiking a trail in November, got to the peak, and took a nap with some people still hiking. I woke up 30 minutes later to nobody around. It was still before 4 p.m., so I wasn't worried. However, I forgot that I was in a valley, and by 4 p.m. I was hiking by headlamp only walking this ridgeline. This is when the shrines started appearing and echoing in the darkness around me. We're talking one every 5 to 10 minutes or so. It gets weirder. As time goes on, I swear I hear footsteps behind me, but I convince myself it's just my water bottle crinkling and push forward. Later, waiting for my train to get home, I tried replicating the sound with my bottle, but I couldn't. By 5 p.m., it was pitch black with the tree coverage, and I'm hiking in pure darkness. Every once in a while I'd see a deer or boar, but I paid it no mind. But eventually I saw what I thought was a campfire on the trail and went to it thinking I could talk to some campers. They were not campers. I found a group of men burning something heavy over their shoulders into a fire about 12 feet high near a couple shacks in the woods. The fire pit was massive. Something like 3 doors making the back and sides and 1 wall open to toss something on it. It was not trash, and it was not wood because it would have been way too heavy as the bags were massive. At this point, half the shacks start barking at me, and I realized that they were kennels. All the men's flashlights turned to me in the darkness because the dogs had alerted them. I ran on the trail away as fast as I could. While still on the trail, I encountered a lot of no trespassing signs, but I was still on the official trail, and they were facing downhill where I was running. Finally, I get out of the woods and reach the town where I could get home. And each house has their lights on. But I couldn't see anyone inside. Instead, every yard of this Japanese town had an animal in it staring me down. Like lots of animals. Dogs, cats, boars, deers, rabbits, foxes, tanuki. I'm very freaked out at this point and keep going. Eventually, about 30 minutes later, as I make my way to the station in this empty town, a car starts following me. If I stopped, it would end. If I was walking, it would follow. This went on for another 30 minutes until I dashed down a foot trail between some empty dark houses and ran all the way to the station and convenience store. It was a Lawson's. To my surprise, the guy at the counter spoke English and talked about what I had seen. He was just as confused as he said there's nobody living in the woods anymore and there are no dog kennels in the area. When I left the store to go to my train, I looked up and saw there were no lights on the entire mountainside I came down, where previously every house had every light on. I got on a train immediately, stopped at an onsen I had been to clean myself of whatever the duck had just happened, and went home ASAP. This was November of 2020. I have no idea what happened, and I never went back. I usually love hiking at night. I loved it in the desert on my PCT hike and in the mountains near my home in Virginia. And I continued to hike later in Hokkaido and Kyoto. But I swore to never hike at night in Japan again. Nothing has ever spooked me more than that. Hiking with my father, uncle, and a retired former Alaskan hunting guide in the outback for a 2-day trip before the end of the holiday. It had to be 10 or 11 at night, but the sky was clear, so the light was that really uncanny bright moonlight. Sitting around the fire after eating, all quiet, some motion in the far distance sort of caught my eye, and I instinctively said, "A deer?" Before my brain went, I thought, we don't have those. But I could in that moment swear to duck and God it was a deer. I'd been living in Massachusetts for university, I saw them all the time. I was absolutely sure. Uncle grabbed my leg and stopped me from getting up, saying, "You didn't see it, you didn't hear it, you don't invite it." And we all just sat there staring very focused into the fire for a half hour. You could deadass hear whatever was shuffling around us in various locations, and then it made a weird, like croaky, gross laugh sound and whacked off at an absolutely insane speed. We hike every time I'm home for holiday, but I tell you what, we don't hike around there. So I don't make too many fellow Oz eyes twitch, I know we have deer. But this wasn't a sambar or a fallow, and it was like jet black, so it wasn't a red. I called it a deer. Because it was deer-shaped but all kinds of off-tilt in features. It also looked like someone had cut its legs off at the knees, and it was walking on the stumps, it was so short. I've seen hundreds of deer in the outback, I've never seen this one, and I know we don't have anything like it. I was about 13 or 14. My dad, my uncle, my little cousin, and I were on a dirt bike/quad trip up the trails surrounding the Goat River, beside Creston, BC. We had finished most of our riding for the day, and we found a quaint little camping spot next to the river. It was probably 5/6 p.m., not dark but not super bright out either. We had a campfire going with some fish we'd managed to catch cooking over it. My cousin, who was probably around 10 years old, wandered to the river. We heard him calling for us to come over because he saw a dog. The adults and I hastily sprint over because we knew it probably wasn't a dog and was most likely a coyote eyeing up the child for a quick snack. What we found wasn't exactly a coyote but could only be described as eerily close. It was longer, slender, had big eyes, and, to top it off, was standing upright on its hind legs. It didn't look like a dog standing on its hind legs though, it looked humanoid in stature. It was just staring at us, never once looking away. Looking at it longer, its face didn't seem to be canine in any capacity. It had human-esque features with a fur-covered body. My dad and uncle both seemed frightened. My uncle grabbed my cousin and put him on top of their quad while my dad told me to get my backpack and my tent bag and that we weren't staying in the woods that night. As my uncle walked back towards the campsite, the thing across the river started walking towards us. It took long strides into the quick-moving water without any sign of struggling from the currents. As soon as it got to about waist deep, my dad turned to me and yelled, "We've got to go, and we've got to go now." We dashed back to our camp. My uncle and cousin were both on their quads, and my dad yelled, "Leave your shit, just turn the bike on and get out." My uncle and I revved up our engines and peeled out of there as fast as we could, my dad following shortly behind us. My dad's a very stoic and composed individual. We raced back to our trucks, which must have taken 2 to 3 hours in the pitch black. Once we got back, my dad claimed that he saw it sprinting behind us as we drove away. That it must have been going over 30/50ths of a kilometer an hour and that it was running on 2 legs. My dad's Native American, we're actually Iroquois Indian, and he swore that what we saw was a skinwalker or something else. Either way, I've never been that terrified in my life, and I've never seen my father more shaken than that night. Went for a wander in BC, Canada, lost the trail, and let me tell you, it gets dark, like dark. Literally can't see your hand in front of your face, dark in the forests when the sun goes down. I'm alone, no source of light on me, dead silent, and literally feeling my way along the ground and from tree to tree trying to find a road or train tracks or something. Then suddenly I hear the most terrifying blood-curdling lady scream I've ever heard and feel myself go numb. It was loud and close, straight up, I thought someone was being murdered. Things are a fuzz from that point to when I finally stumbled onto a road, but I know I was hauling ass as best I could. Fully repressed the entire thing until years later I was watching a video about wild animals, and they showed footage of cougars screaming at night. Holy shit, as soon as I heard it, I went numb and started shaking, then memory came rushing back of that night. I thought I heard a woman get killed in the forest. Once I settled down, it occurred to me that I'm only alive right now because that cougar let me live. I'm not a small guy, 6'1", 215 pounds, athletic, and I don't really get scared, but I was absolutely terrified, and anyone that thinks they can square up with a cougar is a moron beyond help. Even though they're not super big, they will end your lineage, and you won't even hear it. Hike with friends, stick to trails, be aware of remaining daylight in your current location, bring a flashlight, bring a whistle, and drink water. Well, when you say wilderness, you probably mean like a bear or something, I assume. Mine's a little different. I was 18 at the time and female. I should have known better, but I didn't think anything bad would happen. Was hiking alone in an area with bad signal by our local river. I had a bikini on underneath and was planning to take a dip when I got to the water. A 50-ish-year-old male jogger passed me, and in my peripheral vision I saw him do a double take. I got a bad feeling and began walking faster. I saw him turn around. I wasn't sure if it was to follow me or if it was just a coincidence, so I purposely went off of the trail and sat behind a rock halfway down the hill to wait for him to pass by. I peeked around the rock, and he had started on his way towards it. We made eye contact, but even if I hadn't stuck my head out, he was very close to finding me anyway. I wish I would have just acted like a bitch, told him to get lost and that I wasn't interested, but I froze. In fear, and as he started a conversation, I just tried not to let him see that I was scared as I conserved back with him. He left, and I continued down to my usual spot. But I had a bad feeling still. Sure enough, he had still been following me and came down to me by the water. He said he would have a hard time staying off of me, especially if I said no. He wanted me to take my top off, and I said no. He wanted me to get in the water for him, but I said no. He said, "Come on, why won't you get in? Am I going to have to force you?" He gets in the water, starts moaning, and tells me to look away for unholy reasons. He got out and had a boner. He left again, but of course I still didn't feel safe, and I looked behind the rocks, and he had climbed up above me and said, "Dan, I was hoping to see you with your shirt off." After that, I didn't see him again. I was shaking so bad and still frozen in fear. I had no way of knowing if he was truly gone or not. This whole thing probably lasted about an hour. So I finally took a deep breath and told myself I couldn't stay there all day and went as fast as my lungs could keep up with me back to my car. That was 4 years ago, and besides the mental trauma, I'm amazed that nothing bad happened to me. I'm embarrassed by the story, and only my current boyfriend and a few of my church officials know that it happened. Well, we didn't really see anything between the guide and me. But it was a scary moment for us nonetheless, so I'll try to describe it in the best way I can. 2 years ago, I went on a hiking trip. We, being me and my friends with other people in the group that we have just met, planned to see the sunrise on the top of the hill, so we started hiking at around 3 a.m. We set up some tents at the base of the hill, and some of us chose to stay at the campsite. And so, to get to the hill, you need to cross a little jungle first, for a half hour or so, depending on your pace. It was dark, so dark. We had our headlamps on, but somehow I began to lose breath. I cannot cope with the other hikers. I was so far behind that one of the guides decided, okay, I cannot continue with the hike, and I need to go back to the camp with him. We did, too. Not the greatest moment in my life. The path was narrow, I was walking in front while the guide was behind me. We heard the sound of wings flapping above us. Bird wings, only the wings seemed to be so large because we can feel the wind blowing. Like it was so big, it was covering both of us. And I instinctively dropped myself to the ground because I could feel something trying to grab my head from above. The guide behind me then went and threw his body upon me, like he was protecting me from something. Even though we didn't see anything. I cried, and he shouted so loud, he was trying to shove something away. We stay like that for a whole 5 minutes, I couldn't stop crying, but then we still need to move because it was still 2 hours away till dawn. Only this time, we walked together, side by side, holding each other tight. When we safely reached the camp, the guide told me that he had no idea what that creature was. It wasn't something he had ever heard of, but we both heard the flapping sound, we both felt the wind blowing, and we both knew something was trying to take me. We reacted solely on our instincts that day. As I am writing this, I am 14 and living with my family in Massachusetts. About 70 feet behind my house there is a smaller cranberry bog, and further behind it is at least half a mile of more cranberry bogs. To the right of the large sets of cranberry bogs there are woods, and throughout these woods are trails just wide enough for a bike to pass through. The first event involves the smaller strawberry bog. It was the summer of 2013, and at the time the grass was quite tall in the bog. I do not remember the exact day, but I do know it was late August, as this event occurred around the time of my birthday. That night I went swimming in my pool after the sun had gone completely down. After about 5 minutes, I began to feel uneasy. There seemed to be more noise in the tall grass than just the wind blowing through, so I decided to dry up and head inside. At the time I had no belief that there was anything more than a coyote or deer, but was still set off nonetheless. My room is on the second floor of my house, and the window faces in the direction of the bogs, so I could easily see anything going on behind my house. After I had gotten ready for bed, I went to go close the shade of my window when I was utterly frozen in fear by seeing 2 red eyes looking right at me from the cranberry bog. I knew they were eyes because I could see them slowly back away from the house as it had been noticed, not just reflectors or tail lights of a car. I could not make out what it was, for it was dark and there was no moonlight, but due to its height, it must have been on 2 legs. We had made eye contact for no more than 20 seconds before it started to back away, and I rushed to close the shades. I jumped into my bed and went under the covers. Still terrified, I began to wonder what I just witnessed. After I calmed down, I did not believe that what I saw was true because it was unexplainable, and I thought I was young and my eyes were just playing tricks on me. Before writing this, I had only begun to connect 2 different unexplainable events, only now believing them myself because of how they are related. In the winter of that same year, my dad and I went snowboarding out in the woods with my dog. It snowed a decent amount the day before and was still snowing just as hard that day. While walking to the woods through the bogs, it was difficult to get into the distance, making me feel isolated and extremely aware of my close surroundings. After walking about 20 minutes into the woods, I saw something I thought looked like a full set of ribs large enough to be those of a deer. I began to think we had walked right into something's hunting grounds, still thinking it was a wolf or coyote and nothing strange. My dad told me that it was just a strange-looking part of a fallen tree, but I knew there were no trees big enough to have a trunk that wide. After 3 more minutes of walking, I noticed something strange. There were large footprints that went by the trail. They were not any person's boot prints or footprints, for that matter, because they certainly had toes, and were too large for any human. Looking back now, it could not have been any animal that would have naturally been in those woods, as I had not recognized them as any prints I had seen before. We walked for 10 more minutes, all the while I was begging my dad to start and head back because I was tired and did not like the idea of snowshoeing through a predator's hunting ground, again not suspecting any more than a wolf. When I began to think of that first memory, I started to see that the creature with red eyes could be the same creature that left the set of ribs behind as well as those strange footprints, so I began to believe I truly had seen those red eyes that summer night. Another thing that could be related to that same creature is that my neighbor's house also has the small cranberry bog behind their house. I won't sugarcoat it and will say they have a lot of money and could spend that money on unnecessary things. My neighbors had bought that land in 2014, and a friend that lived in the house told me it was because their parents did not like the noise that the workers were making and would just buy the land. My friend did not realize that no one had been working in that bog as the cranberries had not even been harvested. I should mention that the workers started the growth of the cranberries a few months before, and even then they were just people and didn't make much noise at all. Now I believe that the creature had gone rummaging around their backyard and deck that was right behind their house, and that the neighbors bought the land to stop the growth of cranberries because they must have thought the animals making noise would go away if there was no food nearby. They must have seen something, or they would have just told my friend their exact motives but did not want to scare her. I still don't know exactly what I saw that summer night or exactly what it was doing so close to my house, but I do know it was something not many people have witnessed and few are unlucky enough to see it in the light of day. I was cherry picking with a couple friends, Ben and Jerry, in the summer of 2015. One night, in between moving to another orchard, we chose to camp somewhere to break from the work. We walked into a little known park in the forest at sunset, so we didn't have much time to find a camp spot. We found off the path a nice forested area with an opening in the trees where the others could fit their tents. There was a couple who joined me and my two friends. Ben and Jerry both offered that I could sleep in their tents, but to avoid any awkwardness, I said I was fine with just my sleeping bag, since I never noticed any bugs either. That night we made a little fire along the creekside on the rocks, cooked some canned foods, and drank a little bit of wine. The moonlight was so bright that we didn't even need a fire to see clearly. We walked back into the forest just several meters away and went to sleep. Sometime in the night I woke up slowly from what sounded like footsteps of a large animal walking down the rocky creekside, closer and closer. The steps got so loud that I started to fear the size of this animal. At this point I was fully awake. The rocks are so large that it had to be massive to make those sounds. I began thinking it was a bear and that I'd be okay, hopefully he just sniffs me and leaves. But then I turned over and realized I had all my food just sitting out. Like the carefree hippie I was. Also imagining a bear coming that close. I started panicking. I was terrified. At this point I could hear this animal walking off the rocks and onto the dirt path into the forest where we were camped, just meters away from my feet. I could hear it right ducking there. The moon was bright enough I would have been able to see it if I looked up, as where I was laying was directly in line with the path from the forest to the creek. I was ready to run. I thought if I continued to lay here, I'm sure it would hear my heart beat with the amount of fear I felt. I lifted just my head and saw nothing but the moonlight reflecting from the creek and stuck to the plan and still ran to Jerry's tent. I screamed for him to help me unzip the tent. I was so freaked out. I cried, and we heard nothing out there. Why did I see nothing? It should have been right there. I heard it walk for so long enough to know it was not a dream. In the morning, my friends saw no footprints and didn't believe me. They said it was a dream. But I know me, I know what I heard, a dream? Bullshit. The summer after, Ben and I were hanging out. I told him I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I felt drawn to go there again. I wanted to know what I heard and should have seen. We drove there one day in the summer of 2016, and before walking into the same forest part that we camped in last year, I said, I feel there's something more to this place, we're going to see something else. In the dirt pathway from the creek to our old campsite, exactly where I believed I would have seen the animal, where it sounded like it would have been, was a large rock with a symbol perhaps burnt onto it. I was amazed. I turned around to tell Ben and saw him focused on rock formations that I walked past without noticing, all in the area where we had camped that one night. They were shaped in huge circles and lines. There were also weird little half-dome structures made of sticks all around us, built against the trees. I told Ben I needed to walk in the other area of the forest where we hadn't been. I felt there was something over there. While walking through, I stopped and got a wave of fear, as if we were being watched. We got through the path to another opening in the forest and saw many more little half-dome structures everywhere. There was a rope tied horizontally from one tree to another with several strings hanging vertically from it with wire-wrapped stones, and some with dangling bones. On the tree next to this was a long string hanging from a branch of a bag of bones wrapped in gold silk. I touched it before seeing the bones poking out. That was the point that me and Ben both said, we need to leave. We both believed we were being watched. We were so intrigued by what we saw, We went back a week later, but I brought my friend Wiz, who practices paganism. He was curious because of the photo of the same symbol on the rock that I showed him. He said it means a symbol of protection. We got in the camp spot and saw the rock formations had changed since the week before, with rose petals covering the ground. We were there for only a few moments before a ducking swarm of mosquitoes thickened the air. It was something I'd never seen before. I couldn't help but think we were what someone was trying to protect this area from. I'll never forget the intuition that drove me to that place and led me through it. I'll never forget the sounds of the footsteps of that person or animal. I know someone else is just as drawn to that place as I am. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened. I grew up in southwest Saskatchewan and moved on to my aunt's farm in 2019 to live in the other house that is on their property. The house is fairly old, but I loved it. It wasn't long after I moved in though that I started to feel uneasy in the house alone. I would close every window when it got dark, as it felt like something was watching me through them every night. Eventually, I decided to get a puppy to keep myself company when my boyfriend at the time was at work or away from the house. It helped to have the company, but I always dreaded having to take her outside when it was dark. For a bit of scene setting, our house sat on the left side of the gravel road. At the back of the house, there was about 10 meters of backyard, and then there was the cow pasture and the cow barn. We didn't own cows, but in the summer another farmer would rent our pasture space, so we would have them on the property. It wasn't uncommon at night to hear coyotes surround the farm, either. And there were tons. Every time I'd go out with my puppy, we'd hear them all around us, too close for comfort. We had a farm dog too, who would keep the coyotes away for the most part as she was huge, but every so often she'd wander elsewhere on the property to scout, and the coyotes would get a little too close for comfort. They always tried to lure my puppy to them, but luckily I kept her leashed. Now, one thing you should know about my pup is that it takes her forever to find a spot to go potty. This is still a problem today, 4 years later, but back then it was the bane of my existence. She would pace for at least 5 minutes, and that was only after finding a suitable spot. Sometimes we would be out there for damn near a half hour, just so she would go, and not go in the house, another problem of hers. Huskies, am I right? On this particular night, it was raining pretty heavily. I was not happy to be out there, and she had decided that she wasn't going to go until she found her perfect spot. We had already been out for 15 minutes, and at this point she was also getting frustrated with the rain and wanted to go inside, but I wanted her to go before we went in since we'd already been out there for so long. So, as any annoyed puppy mother would do, I started getting a little frustrated and would repeat go potty every time she'd get distracted from her objective. It was dark, I was cold and annoyed, and to make matters worse, the cows behind us were fussing quite loudly. This was out of the ordinary for them, they were usually quiet and sleeping at this time of night. I was also hearing what sounded like a strange bird whistling, but I shook it off as probably being an owl. I tried to keep it off my mind as I kept shouting and pleading go through the rain to my small fuzzy white asshole. I was facing away from the pasture, and suddenly in my left ear I heard it, go. Now, one thing you should know about me is that I have a very strong flight response typically, but this froze me on the spot, as I was mostly confused at what I'd just heard. I tried telling myself I didn't hear it. I tried telling myself that it was just a move from a cow that I heard wrong. But again, as if spoken directly behind me, I heard it again. Go. Go. It sounded unnatural. It was as if it came from someone who had never spoken a word before. A raspy, deep, monotone go. It almost sounded like it was coming out of an old radio, but of course there were no radios out there. Every time it said it, it sounded the exact same as the first time it was said. And whatever it was had started repeating it as if it had been taught its new favorite word. At this point, I spun around to the pasture to find nothing there. Then, again from behind me, go. This had all happened in the span of about 3 seconds, and at this point I remember shouting out loud, "All right, don't have to tell me twice," as I picked up my little furball and made a frantic dash for my front door. I swiftly locked both doors behind me and sat bewildered in my kitchen. Puppy went back to puppying immediately, obviously unbothered by it all, and happy mom wasn't making her stay out in the rain any longer. I picked up my phone and called my aunt, asking her if my uncle had been out in the field with the cows. She said no, and I explained to her what had just happened to me. She sent my uncle over to the pasture to check it out, but soon after told me he hadn't seen or heard anything. He said he'd check the pasture again in the morning. I spent my night hiding from the windows, with the lights and TV on loud enough to not hear anything outside. The next morning, when my uncle checked on the pasture, he found 2 calves dead. Explains the colossal cow panic that had ensued the night before. I regret this, but I didn't push for more information as I honestly just didn't want to know, but they told me other than that they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. A few months later, I moved off the farm. I couldn't be in that house alone anymore, and my boyfriend and I had parted ways. A few months after that, I started going to therapy for the paranoia this had caused me. I started feeling like people were watching me, out to get me. Another few months after that, I moved out of the province for good and finally felt safe. I'm wondering if any of you here have any idea what the hell this would have been. There's no chance there would have been someone in our field, as we were fairly far away from town and neighbors, and we have cameras that would have seen anyone enter our property. Coyotes are common, but I don't think they are capable of mimicking words. Any ideas? Around 15 years ago, 3 of my friends and I went camping. We lived in Perth and traveled south to Yallingup with a tent. We arrived at the campground and realized it was extremely busy, so we drove further down to a small car park right on the beach. Behind us were trees, and we decided to camp in there so as not to be noticed by the campground officers. Everything was fine and lovely, and we set up the tent and started making a small fire just before it got dark. We were all pretty worn out from the drive, and everyone decided to turn in early. The tent was only big enough for 2. My plan was to sleep in the open next to the fire, as was one of my friend Ben's plan too. So one of the guys in the tent, Leon, goes to relieve himself down near the cars. I lay my head down on my jacket, next to the fire. Just as I do, I hear the rushing of leaves. I open my eyes, head still down. I'm trying to see what is making the noise. It's night, but the sky is light, and I can see the trees silhouetted against it. I notice what seems to be a tree at least 10 feet tall rapidly moving towards me. It zigs and zags supernaturally as it comes quickly towards me. I see it is not touching the ground as it moves, but its quick movements are making the leaves move and rustle as it passes over them. By this point I was sitting up and screaming quietly, like an injured baby animal, according to the boys. The guy sitting next to me is also sitting up by this point and saying, "What the duck is that?" It is tall and very thin, like a tree with very long and skinny arms, legs, hands, feet, fingers, and toes. Its head is shaped like a football on its side. It has glowing yellow eyes. It wants me. It's coming for me. It's a meter from me. At this stage, I grabbed Ben's arms and wrapped them around me and buried my head in them, closing my eyes and making myself as small as possible. I was still quietly screaming. I hear the rushing of leaves go right next to me and then continue past me. My friend Ben says, "What the duck was that?" At which point I jump into the tent, refusing to come out. Leon comes back just after that and asks why he could hear me screaming. I explained what happened and that I would be sleeping in the tent even though there was not enough room. My friend Ben stayed up all night with a knife, waiting in case it came back. We left early the next morning. A few years later, I spent some time researching anything I could find related to the topic in the hopes I might find some answers. I read that apparently, if you are a woman or child, you should never go to sleep around an open campfire near an ocean or a river. It turns out, we camped near the mouth of a river in the ocean. If you fall asleep next to a fire, the bunyip can see you at night from miles away and will take you in your sleep. I'm still not sure what happened, but I will never forget it. Since I was about 8 or 9, I have been an avid outdoorsman and hunter, often going hunting with my grandfather and my dad's best friend. I never was much on the paranormal, nor had I ever experienced anything abnormal as such in all my years prior to what happened one weekend after Christmas at the hunting club I belonged to. I had just gotten a brand new Remington Model 700 BDL 243 rifle with a Bushnell 3x9 scope and couldn't wait until I could get my first deer with it. We went to the club as per usual after Christmas and stayed until New Year's to finish out my usual time spent at the club. One morning we went to a place that was called the Third Piece, named after the logging company that would harvest the wood around there. I was going to a particular tree stand that we put up before the season that I scouted out as it overlooked a beautiful gully and the entire ridge was well traveled by deer as we found several trails that they used during the year. Went up in the stand, which was about 40 feet off the ground and right on the side of the ridge, which gave you a bird's eye view considering nothing around but hardwoods and open areas previously harvested that summer. Looking back now, I finally pieced together why one of our dog drivers would never set foot on that property but allowed his son, who was in his 20s at the time, to drive the dogs, and the father, whom we will call Jack, seemed to always talk about how it hurt his legs to push the dogs through the land even though he had no injuries or physical ailments that affected him on any other place we hunted. However, as I was saying, I was up in the tree stand, and you could hear just the birds and normal animals around, but there was no wind that day to obscure the sound, so it was perfect from a hunter's standpoint. About 6:30 or 7 I heard the dog driver pushing the dogs through the area near me, and they were hot on the scent of a deer by their barking and heading in my direction. Then all of a sudden everything went silent. No dogs, no dog driver, no animals around me. For about, I guess, 2 minutes, I heard dead silence, which had me puzzled, but I didn't think anything of it until I started to hear what I thought was a deer walking along the ridge parallel to where I was waiting. This went on for a few minutes as it seemed to walk back and forth just out of my sight, like it wasn't sure if it should come down the ridge or keep on going. Finally, after listening to this for a few more minutes out of frustration, I held up my rifle, scanning the ridge, searching for the animal, thinking it had to be a buck, cautious about where it was heading. As I was scanning through the scope, I stopped dead in mid-scan as I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there was what I can only describe as a dark shadow of a human-like figure standing on the ridge next to a big tree looking right at me. The problem was I could see through the figure as I saw the leaves behind it, and then all of a sudden the eyes, for lack of a better term, started to glow a dark red and were the biggest part of its head, like twice the size of what they should be. At first I put the rifle down and rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just seeing things, which would have been dangerous as hell that the dog driver was playing around with me, but quickly dropped that notion as he was not one to play games, and you don't do something that's stupid with people around you knowing they have weapons on them. I picked my rifle back up and scoped back onto the tree, and IT was still standing there looking right at me, and all of a sudden it made an unnatural movement back behind the tree. By unnatural, I mean it sort of glided, not stepped back behind the tree, as if it were hiding for some reason, although I felt that it wanted me to see it for some reason. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I then noticed that it was so quiet that you could hear nothing but your breath. So I scoped out the tree again, and all I could see was what looked like part of its arm from the shoulder down to the elbow but was still visible and not moving. I then decided to go to hell with the deer. I am getting the hell out of here. However, I put the rifle over my shoulder and took out my .357 Magnum as I climbed down the tree stand, all the while never taking my eyes off that tree. It was awkward climbing down the tree with a pistol in your hand and thick hunting clothing on, but I was not about to be caught empty-handed just in case. When I got to the bottom of the stand, I had this sudden feeling of dread and that a million eyes were staring at me across the ridge. I holstered the pistol and put the scope back on the tree, and yes, it was still behind it, so I yelled out the dog driver's name just in case and got no response, and that is when I said screw this, clicked off the safety, and decided to fire a round into the tree just to the right of the shadow figure. Upon doing this, the shadow glided back out again in full view, and I quickly sat down the rifle and whipped out my pistol and fired 6 rounds off right at it, deciding that I was done playing whatever game it was playing, and after the 3rd or 4th shot, it glided back behind the tree. Thus I emptied the weapon into the tree and thanked the Lord for speed loaders, which I carried 2 of on my belt, and what seemed like an eternity loaded my pistol again, and when I got ready to unload another 6 rounds into the tree, the shadow was completely out of sight this time, and I never took my eyes off the tree, so I know it didn't take off running, nor did it hide behind another tree closer by. I was not, however, going to wait around to either be attacked by whatever the hell this was or sit there and even think about hunting as my day was over and I wanted to get as far away from this area as possible. I got my crap and went back to the truck and waited for the rest of the guys to come out after the drive was over, and when they came back to the truck, they were like, "Okay, where's the deer?" They thought I had shot something, but I was not about to tell them what I saw but said that I hit it, but it got up and ran back towards the dogs. They were like, "Let's go see if we can track it," thinking it was wounded or died further off. I told them, "Hell no, I am not about to walk that step gully and go look for it," knowing I didn't even see a deer, but they were like, "Come on, you might have gotten one." The strangest thing was the guy Jack, the other dog driver, would not take his eyes off me when I was adamant about not going back to look for it, as if he knew that I didn't shoot a deer and that I had seen something, but it was no damn deer. I kept it to myself for the main reason of not having the guys make fun of me and also for the sake of making them feel uncomfortable that they are hunting with a guy that has a high-powered rifle and a handgun that is seeing things in the woods. These guys wouldn't have believed me for a second, and I dropped it and repressed it for all these years until watching these series about abnormal or paranormal sightings in the woods, and one story about shadow people gave me the chills, as well as like having a flashback of something I had long since blocked out of my mind. I thought I would share this story so I could finally get it off my chest, as I at last know that I am not crazy about what I saw, and now older and wiser people don't give a damn about who does or does not believe me, as I know what I witnessed and to this day still hunt, with the exception of this particular area that I will never set foot on again. But looking back, it explains the odd behavior of another member of the club who obviously saw or experienced something similar. Sadly, he passed away before we could get a chance to talk about it or discuss his sighting. But there is something in this particular area of Prince Edward County, Virginia, that I just want to warn people about. Even though it didn't try and harm me, I sensed that it was not anything of this reality that we live in, nor was it there for my well-being, as if it was letting me know that I was not wanted there, as well as the sense of dread and despair that gave me the impression that it was some evil presence that I didn't want to get too close to. Lord knows what would have happened had I gone towards it or stayed out there any longer than I was. For the first time in my life, I think I got a chance to see what real evil looked like, and I hope that's the last time, and this is all the proof I need to know firsthand. I live in rural Southwest Virginia, in Appalachia, and heard odd whistling in the woods a few days ago at night. It started when I was playing airsoft alone in the woods at about 7 p.m., in almost pitch black. I live a lonely existence, and was walking around the woods behind my house. I got to a clearing just on top of a hill and sat down to take a rest. Just when I sat down, I heard odd whistling. It was perfect whistling and whistled a tune I had never heard before. It was clear, and it sounded close, within 150 feet or less, and came directly from behind me. It would have had to be in the woods, near the property line with one of our neighbors. It instantly gave me chills down my back, and I got the feeling of being watched. I, not being an idiot and having a brain, wasted no time sprinting full speed down towards my house, hopping over rocks and limbs. The whistling stopped shortly after I got moving, but I still felt like I was being watched and like something was off. I didn't see anything when I did turn back to look while opening a gate, but that may be because of the darkness and the distance I had moved. I don't think it was a bird, as the leaves on the trees haven't regrown yet, and it still stays cold at night and sometimes during the day, but I don't know much about birds. There were also no birds to be seen, and everything else was quiet. I also doubt it was a person, as I heard no talking, no leaves crunching, no talking, and no other noises. I should also mention the whistling started out of nowhere and did not gradually get louder, as if someone or something was moving closer while whistling. I should also mention that I've been in those woods a decent amount of my life and have never heard anything like it before, not even once. I was a bit tired, but I've been more tired before while being up in those woods at similar times before, and I'm not one to hallucinate. The situation still gives me chills when I think about it. I've had the feeling of being watched before in those woods, but those feelings have never been so intense and extreme as that one night. I was hoping anyone could figure out what it was. Was it an animal? Maybe, but me and my family, have dogs around the house and most wild animals stay away, and I haven't really seen anything outside of a bear or two and deer in those woods. I should also mention the dogs occasionally bark randomly into the woods, but they weren't really barking at the moment when the whistling happened. I was hoping anyone could identify what it was, maybe if there is even enough information, and I'm not saying it was paranormal, but I'm not saying it was just a wild animal. I am an 18-year-old from Northern California. Last year, in 2023, I decided to go on a solo one-night camping trip on a secluded trail. My plan was to set out early and hike all day through beautiful forested mountains until I went off trail and set up camp for the night. The next day I would finish the hike and get picked up by my family where the trail ended on a dirt road. I had been on this trail before with my father and knew it very well. It rarely is marked on maps, which is why I like hiking it. Normally I wouldn't go by myself camping out in the woods, but I was feeling old enough and brave enough to attempt it. I also knew that the chances of seeing another person were close to zero, as I hadn't seen a single other person hiking it before, even in the daytime. I chose this trail because I wanted to camp out in this region, but camping there isn't allowed by the Park Service. So by choosing this trail in particular, there was little chance I got caught and busted by some other hikers. For this reason, I chose not to start a fire and instead used a propane cooker. My dad dropped me off at the trailhead. I was by no means unprepared. I had 3 knives on me, a whistle for mountain lions, and plenty of experience in the area. I hiked all day and enjoyed myself until I came to my predetermined camp spot off the trail. I set up my tent, had dinner over my stove, and tucked in for bed. I woke up in the middle of the night rather suddenly. At first I didn't hear anything and thought I woke up randomly. I waited a few moments, laying up with my eyes open. Then I heard a twig beak not far from my tent. I didn't panic immediately, as I thought it could be a deer or raccoon. I was going to make a noise to scare it off, but before I did, I heard 2 consecutive steps pressing on the pine needles and twigs. My heart began racing as it sounded like a human walking. Keep in mind I am off the trail in a place where I haven't seen anybody before. I reached to my side where I had my buck knife and grabbed it in my hand. I heard the walking come towards my tent but not directly, then stop. I was terrified but kept silent. Even if I wanted to yell, I felt I couldn't. Then I heard something that only confirmed my fears. The thing outside my tent began to hum in a deep guttural tone. There was no doubt it was a person. I gripped my knife, knowing that was all I had to defend myself. The humming continued, but I stayed completely silent, hoping they would just leave. It kept going for what felt like minutes until the person stopped and began walking away from my tent. I then heard scratching on one of the trees near my campsite before I heard them dash away, creating a huge commotion of grass, pine needles, and branches breaking. Needless to say, I did not fall asleep after that and stayed up all night clutching my knife. By morning the sun had come up and I hadn't heard anything else. I got up and immediately began packing my things to make a frantic dash for the end of the trail. I ran while constantly looking back. I ended up at the dirt road by noon and called my family to pick me up. They did, and I relayed the whole story. To this day I haven't gone back on that trail, and I made the difficult decision not to inform the authorities, as I couldn't pin anyone to a crime and it would mean admitting that I illegally camped in the area. This past year I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. There was about 600 miles of the trail I hiked/camped alone. One of these sections I was alone was in Northern California, slightly north of Shasta. I got to a beautiful spot and knew it was the best spot to set up camp. It was gorgeous. 360 views of woods and the valley below and mountains everywhere. I could see it raining on Mount Shasta. Probably my favorite campsite in NorCal. I still remember the exact mile and have some footage of the site during daylight. I set up my tent, and after admiring the sunset, I went to bed. I could see outside below the vestibule when I was lying down in the tent. As I was trying to go to sleep, I saw a white light in the valley, maybe about a quarter to a half mile away. Not right near my tent or anything. I wasn't close to any towns. In the Sierra Mountains, south of this area, I would see an occasional remote cabin in the woods, so I figured it was that. But there were no access points or dirt roads. No forest clearings. Just thick woods surrounded by mountains. I looked at the light for a bit and tried to think of what it could have been, but this was pretty remote, so I didn't know. I was worn out from hiking all day, so I didn't think too much of it. A little later I looked out again and noticed another light. It was an orange light slowly circling the white light. It was slowly morphing in shape as it circled. I watched it for a while, trying to understand what I was looking at. It had a very calm motion, and it was almost mesmerizing. It wasn't like a lot of people's orb/UFO experiences where it darts around and then vanishes. I eventually fell asleep. It started raining around midnight, and I looked out of my tent and still saw both lights, one white stationary light and one orange morphing light. I woke up again around 4 a.m. to piss and walked outside my tent, and it was still there. Same motion. I tried to get a video, but due to the distance and darkness, it looked like another shitty video that didn't show anything. I woke up around sunrise and looked for it, but both lights were gone. I didn't see these lights around sunset or sunrise. Only in darkness. I know these would have been visible during sunrise/sunset, too. I'm sure there is an explanation, but I genuinely have no clue what I was looking at. Still trying to figure it out. Unrelated, but near that area I was walking, and to the right of the trail was some thick brush. Maybe 5 to 6 feet tall. This was near the Shasta Trinity Forest area, maybe 1 to 2 days after the lights in the woods. I was hiking alone, and I noticed about 100 feet away from the brush was being flattened by something, and it was moving very quickly. It was approaching the trail and was going to end up right next to me if I had continued my pace. I couldn't see what was flattening this brush, but it had to be strong. It reminded me of something you'd see in Jurassic Park. I assumed it was a bear, I still think it was, but I didn't want to surprise the bear and have a close encounter. I yelled, "Stop!" And then it stopped. Completely. I stayed still and waited to see what was going on, but it was completely still. And it was really quiet everywhere, total silence. I got pretty unsettled and started talking to whatever it was while I walked by. I just kept saying things like, "I'm going to walk by and be on my way, my friend. Hope you're having a good day." I kept walking and kept looking back, but nothing moved from that point onward. Like I said, it's probably a bear. Black bears are generally like big raccoons and don't want to interact with humans. But I encountered a few bears, and they always ran away when I told them to get lost. After speaking with other hikers, I noticed I met a few people who said NorCal was a little unsettling. The SoCal desert is very windy, and the Sierra Mountains have tons of flowing streams. NorCal doesn't have as many streams or as much wind, so there is just a silence that pervades, which can feel ominous, especially in the dark. That's my explanation for the feeling, at least. But after going through the SoCal desert, Sierra Mountains, NorCal, Oregon, and Washington, NorCal was the only section that was a little unnerving to me. And I did portions of each of these sections alone also. My name is Haroon Mekmedinovic, and I am a BBC Earth/Nat Geo photographer and cinematographer. A few years ago, something very strange happened to me and my shooting partner Gavin Heffernan at Vermilion Cliffs in Arizona, and we have privately told the story to friends but didn't figure making it public made much sense until a friend of mine sent me one of your videos, Skinwalker Ranch, which echoed almost identical things that happened to us. Me and Gavin have specialized in night sky photography and have covered all 50 American states and Canadian provinces, spending full nights in most remote places. However, of over 1,000 of those nights we have spent shooting, we have absolutely never had anything like this happen. We made our way to White Pocket inside Vermilion Cliffs, which is an amazing collection of swirling white lithified sandstone rocks. We decided to spend a night there shooting time-lapses for a BBC Earth short film and were the only ones there that night. We set up our 6 cameras, rolled them, and decided to get some sleep. We set a timer for 1 a.m. to wake up and move our cameras to different places so we can shoot another set of shots when I turned and saw lights that initially looked like headlights but made no sense as they were in the direction of the park where there were neither any roads nor trails. I pointed it out to Gavin, and we looked at it for a bit, and the more we looked, the more it appeared it wasn't headlights but possibly a headlamp of a hiker. However, there were no trails in that area, and we figured perhaps a hiker got lost and was wandering around towards us as they may have spotted our headlamps. We decided to stick around and wait, as we were worried it might be someone who might take our cameras. We looked, and light was getting closer, and when closer. At some point it was bright enough to be reflecting on the white rocks there, but then it suddenly stopped. We sat there and waited, and nothing. When a couple minutes later lights were back much further away, and there was no way a hiker could have backtracked a couple miles in a matter of 5 minutes. That disturbed us enough that we didn't go back to our tents but rather stayed there to sleep next to the cameras. This was a bizarre event, but we would have somewhat shrugged it off if something hadn't happened the following night. We drove to the other side of the park and hiked into a famous rock structure area called the Wave. Only about 20 people are allowed in there a day via a permit, so we figured if we stayed overnight, being 3 miles away from the parking lot, we wouldn't get any lights flashing around from cars or hikers, and we could shoot night sky videos there. It's an extremely dark area at night, of which you can't see the hand in front of your face variety. We did the same as the previous night, set up cameras, and went to sleep with the alarm set at 1 a.m. Unlike White Pocket, the Wave is situated amongst canyons that are highly echoey. You can very slots hear a little rock roll half a mile away. Footsteps or any other sounds are easily heard. When we woke up, we went back to places where we left our cameras and set up new shots. However, when I went back to the spot and left one of my cameras, it was missing. We left it there in the dark with nobody around. I frantically looked for it all around and nothing. I suspected I may have forgotten where I exactly put it, but I was 100% certain it was where I went to find it. I went to Gavin and asked if he recalled where I put it, and he said he was absolutely sure it was where we thought it was. We searched for it more, covering the whole area. Then, we stood there, quiet, trying to see if we could hear the sound of camera shutter clicks somewhere in the dark, but there was nothing. We agreed to go back to sleep and look for it in the morning, when suddenly a loud thud reverberated through the canyon. We pointed our lights and walked in the direction of the sound. It was my camera, fallen over. There was no wind, no sounds of animals we would have easily heard, and no people. The camera was still clicking, taking shots. Something we also would have heard when we started listening to the sounds earlier. We were beside ourselves as to how this could have happened because we set up our tripod legs wide as to anticipate a possible bump of the camera by something. But in this case, the camera would have had to have been pushed over or dropped by something. I remember Gavin turning to me and saying, "I'm an atheist, but this one really made me wonder." The following morning I drove Gavin back to his car, and he went towards Los Angeles. I went to the city of Page, Arizona, where I planned to do a night of shooting in the Waterholes Canyon. That's just underneath State Highway 89, about 5 miles south of the town. I tried to put the last night's event in the back of my mind, as I was having to shoot alone this night. I was still in the general Vermilion Cliffs area, but this was just outside the park. And I was close to the town, so unlike the last 2 nights, which were in a completely remote area, this was underneath a highly utilized bridge over a busy state road. I parked and made my way down into the canyon to scout things out in daylight. I wanted to grab a shot of the bridge from inside the canyon, looking up with the night sky above it. As I made my way down into the canyon hiking down a trail, I started to smell something very strange. The closer I got to the canyon area underneath the bridge, the more I smelled it. When I got there, I spotted next to the bridge support structures what appeared to be a dead dog. I got closer, and it was clear that a smell was coming from there. I then realized it wasn't a dog but a coyote, and it was lying, not like it fell from above but as if someone had set it down. However, the disturbing part was that the coyote was missing its bottom jaw, and it was clearly sliced off and missing. Not ripped but sliced off with precision. I left and never went back again, and I didn't think about all this much until I watched your episode about Skinwalker Ranch. Cat's Eye Night Hike, Terror, Colorado. Traditionally, Girl Scouts do this hike at night. As a kid, I particularly remember it and also remember the terrors it caused myself and some others. How it is done is during the day the older scouts, usually between the ages of 15 and 18, start to prepare with the leaders. They cut out large yellow cat's eyes from construction paper and have phrases written on it, and they staple it to various spots on the hike during the day. Usually this hike is done as a partner hike with one leader for every 4 or 5 girls, and we are given a flashlight. So how does this become scary, adding the fact the trail is haunted? Flying G Ranch in Colorado is historically a working farm and horse rescue. It has since shut down due to a fire. But while working, the trail used for the Cat's Eye hike was a stagecoach trail and went to each different area of the camp. As a result, each area would have different parts of the trail going through. I hated going to even use the bathroom because we always heard a strange roar like a mountain lion, and in the history of the camp there had never been one that close, but during the hike, well, you would hear it. The Cat's Eye hike was always a warm-up for brownies and juniors, just a test of how brave we really were. And for me, this one night with Junior proved to be the worst ever. I was teamed with guests, Tiger Scouts from a neighboring Boy Scout camp. These kids could barely be 7. I was hoping I didn't get lead, but since I had a better flashlight, guess what that was? Me. I had one adult leader, and he was not even aware how this hike worked. That night I could have sworn something else was with us, the usual sounds, the usual growls from the girls doing the hike. One kid, I swear, was crying, and we read off each plaque and went along. The sounds were getting louder, but then I heard something much worse, an actual roar. The adult leader heard me whisper, "We need to head back." Before he asked, another troop leader met up with us and guided us back to the lodge. We heard a loud crash and then a popping sound. Then we were now back at the door to the lodge with the leaders from both Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts informing us 2 very large mountain lions were in the camp. We were told to stay in, and our stuff was brought from the various campgrounds to us. The Boy Scouts were packed up to their buses and left. I kept my thoughts to myself about what I felt and saw. Several of us girls remember red eyes watching us when we walked that trail, and we remember that the Cat's Eye hike to us scared away something much worse in the forest. We just never said what it was, we never talked about what was in our camp. But to this day, I am convinced that Fly G Ranch had a skinwalker, not a mountain lion. My husband and I went camping in Willamette Forest in July 2021. This was a long-awaited trip, as I had been asking to go camping here for a little over a year since I have driven through it many times on my trips to see my family in Nevada. However, this trip will turn out to be the first and last time we ever go camping here. I'm very glad we didn't have our children or dog with us during this trip. We didn't have a set camping spot, but I had called the ranger station ahead to ask where the dispersed camping locations were. I took note of a specific spot that I thought would be ideal as it was directly across the highway from Salt Creek Falls, which was our main attraction for going. This spot wound up being the only option open for us since most spots were already taken. My husband was hesitant about the area as we started up the road, worrying that it wasn't a spot we could camp at, but I had gotten specific directions from the ranger and felt confident that this was the spot. The road forked, and on one side was what looked like an old abandoned logging site, and the other was a road that seemed to go deep into a very thickly forested and hardly traveled dirt road. We took that dirt road up a way and discovered what looked like a very old and overgrown road down to a camping spot. I thought it was perfect. We noticed fairly quickly that that place felt off. It took me a while to figure out why. There are no animal sounds. Not a single animal to be seen or heard. We also felt like we were being watched. We quickly decided neither of us would be going anywhere without the other. The first night we put a bag of our trash, steak packaging and other food scraps, tied to a tree a safe distance away from our site in case it attracted anything. We didn't get a wink of sleep that night. We heard a couple of things walking around the site, tapping, and I swear something came right next to the vehicle at one point. We were sleeping in the vehicle. Anytime I felt it was getting too close, I'd blast my high beams and sound the truck alarm. I was not messing around. Anytime either of us had to go to the bathroom, we turned on the truck lights and stuck together. The next morning, once we felt comfortable enough, we decided to get out and make breakfast. There were no tracks anywhere, only our own, and nothing touched our trash bag. At this point, I was severely spooked. I couldn't wrap my head around everything that happened that night, leaving no tracks, and if it was an animal, why wouldn't it go for the trash? The trash was not up a tree, simply next to it. My husband tried convincing me to leave early so we didn't have another night of that, but I was pissed. We hardly get time to ourselves, and we had been planning this for too long. We agreed to try one more night. That second day we left the campsite and explored the other areas to see if we could at least change campsites, but there was nothing. We at least got away from it for a while to have fun for the day. Towards the end of the day, we got back and decided not to be out once it was dark. I should also note that there were still no animals to be seen or heard here. We heard them in other areas, but not at that site. That night wound up being a ramped up version of the previous night, but weirder. We decided to put on a movie on our computer to help distract us and hopefully help us sleep. Problem was our external hard drive had mysteriously disappeared. I knew we brought it, but it was now gone. I went through everything in the truck more than once and was growing more and more frustrated the longer I couldn't find it. My husband also attempted to find it to no avail. I finally gave up, and we played some card games instead. A while later I went to put everything away for bed, and the damn thing suddenly appeared in front of me like it had been there all along. I'm thoroughly convinced that something or someone was messing with me. No, it wasn't my husband. He enjoys sleeping with me. My husband and I both kind of laughed it off and decided to watch a movie in bed. He had quickly fallen asleep, but I had no such luck. Thoughts of the night before, the hard drive, and lack of animal activity had me too spooked. The sounds of walking and tapping noises seemed to be even closer to the vehicle this night. I didn't want to go outside at all, but at one point I could no longer wait. I woke my husband, who was startled awake and said he'd had a nightmare that someone was trying to take us. We went outside anyway though and quickly took care of business, the entire time feeling very on edge like we were being watched. Once we were back inside the vehicle, I decided to see if I could see anything when the noises would start. I never could see anything making the noises. At one point I looked up towards the passenger window and saw a handprint on the window. I couldn't wipe it off from the inside of the vehicle either. I was severely spooked and didn't sleep the rest of the night. When it was the morning, I could hardly bring myself to step outside. I was so shaken. My husband and I agreed to quickly pack up, making sure not to leave any trash, and leave. As we were leaving, I noticed a log slightly uphill that was completely white, not birch. I know some fungus can cause this, but it didn't look natural, it looked painted. I'm not sure if this is nothing or not, but it seemed odd to me. We were in such a hurry to leave that place we didn't even bother making coffee. Never going back there again. Not sure what was out there watching us and terrifying us, but I felt we were not welcome. The story I am about to share takes place on two different occasions. My grandparents live in rural southern Ohio, near the edge of the Appalachian Trail. Growing up, you always heard ghost stories of what happens out there when the sun goes down. My grandparents' house sits on 5 acres, surrounded by thick wooded areas. On the property there are 7 different trails that lead you all around my grandparents' house that we usually use for hunting. One day, my brother and I decided we wanted to go down to the creek and watch for animals while also looking for cool rocks that I loved to collect at the time. At the split, the only way to get down to the creek is to walk, as the four-wheeler is too big to fit through all of the thick brush and trees on that specific trail. So we ditched the four-wheeler and took off on foot. The trail down to the creek is about a mile long. The sun was shining through the trees, and it was a crisp fall evening where there was a slight breeze. My brother and I goofed off until we finally made it to the creek. We walked alongside the water for maybe 15 minutes looking for cool rocks, as I said before. As we are walking, we stumble across a broken down shed that both my brother and I had never seen. It is important to mention that my grandparents' property has markers, letting everyone know where their property begins and ends. Standing on the left side of the creek, the shed was on the opposite side. My brother and I kind of looked at each other with confused looks, but eventually my brother got distracted by something else and continued his walk down the creek. But not me. I felt myself fall into some sort of trance. I felt as if I needed to go inside. I yelled for my brother to come back. I think we should check this out some more. I mean, something inside me wants to go inside. My brother has never been a fan of anything remotely scary. Seeing this rundown shed that looked to be falling apart did not interest him in the slightest. My brother said to me, "Hey, this is one of those situations in a scary movie where the people should have just minded their business. You are not going in there." I kind of chuckled because he was right. Something was telling me to go in there, but I also knew it probably wasn't the best idea as the sun was starting to set. My brother and I collected our rock findings and headed back to the house. This next part happened the following weekend. My boyfriend at the time came out to visit. While he was there, I mentioned the fact that my brother and I had stumbled across a creepy shed that was on the property that we'd never seen before. He became extremely interested as I described the feeling I had of wanting to go inside. I told him how compelled I was to go to the building. That's all it took before we were out the door and making our way back down to the creek. My brother stayed behind, saying, "If you guys don't come back, I told you so." My ex-boyfriend and I laughed like, "Yeah, right." With us we had overalls and flashlights as we didn't take the four-wheeler and decided to just walk the whole way down. We had flashlights due to the fact that when we left, we knew we only had about 2 hours until the sun went down. Eventually, we make it down to the creek. We walked the same way that my brother and I had the week previously. And to my shock and disbelief, the shed was no longer there. I start frantically looking around, saying, "What? How? I swear it was here." My ex-boyfriend and I decide to walk a little bit further, venturing further and further away from my grandparents' house. Still no sign on the shed. We hadn't realized how long we were out there. The sun maybe had 15 more minutes of light left for the day. I was so determined to prove myself right that I had seen the shed with my own 2 eyes. We pull out our flashlights and jump across the bank to the other side of the creek and begin walking back the way we came. I was hoping that I had just missed it on the way down as my ex and I were talking. The sun was completely down at this point. As we are walking and talking, my ex falls silent. We were mid-conversation, so when I hear him stop dead in his tracks, I do the same. I start saying, "What is it?" What he said next sent chills down my spine.
I want you to listen to me very carefully.
When I count to 3, we are going to jump to the other side of this creek, and we are going to run as fast as we can. Don't say anything, don't look back. My heart falls to my stomach, and in that moment I didn't question him. I just prepared myself to run. We sprinted as fast as we could. I was in front of my ex, and I could hear him wincing in pain. But I heard more than just our running, like something was chasing us. We ditched the whole idea of running a mile all the way back to the trail and decided to make a run for it straight through the woods. When we made it back to the house, we were gasping for air and covered in scratches from running through thick brush. We walked through the front door, and I was in shock to the point where I could not answer my grandma's questions. My ex-boyfriend was gripping his back and wincing in pain. My grandma lifted his shirt to look at his back. 3 long scratches ran from his shoulder to his lower back. He had seen something in those woods that night, and whatever it was chased us all the way back to the house, leaving me in a shocked state and my ex-boyfriend with 3 scratch marks from whatever was chasing us. From one appellation to another, don't go looking for something you don't want to find. And if anyone knows what this could have been, please let me know. This occurrence still keeps me up at night. When we were about 20, my friends and I were really big into doing scary trips to haunted roads and things of that nature. This one is about Clinton Road, deemed the most haunted road in America, so scary they even made a movie about it. This story takes place before the movie was even a thought. So there was a group of our friends. There were 3 of us that were the closest, and then 2 more that would tag along here and there. I had to work late on a Friday night, so they decided to go visit this road without me. Most of it sounded like the typical hype and adrenaline scared. One thing stuck out. They told me when they were there they received texts from an unknown number, stating, "Why are you on Clinton Road?" And the texts even described what my friends were doing and wearing. They showed me the texts, but I figured they were faking it, trying to make it sound scary, knowing I'd be mad that I missed out. They also explained to me a legend that a child died in the water under the bridge on the road and that if you threw change, the ghost boy would return the change to you, known to us as the Ghost Boy Bridge. On top of that, there's a ridiculous bend in the road there called Dead Man's Curve that even if you're doing a modest 30 miles per hour, you could easily crash and tumble off the cliff. It's said that a ghost truck will chase you throughout the road and try to get you to crash. I called total bullshit. I then convinced them to take me the next day, being I was off from work. It did not disappoint. We get there, and immediately I see the road is in the middle of the woods, covered with ritual signs all over the road. I knew that this was not a typical road. We came up to the bridge and parked. As soon as we got out of the car, I checked everyone's pockets so that they wouldn't be trying to pull anything slick to try drop change in the road when I wasn't looking. There were a total of 5 quarters, 1 for each of us. We all tossed them in the water over the bridge. About 5 minutes go by in total silence. I decided to break the silence by stating, "Told you, bullshit." We then turned to walk back to the car. We got about 10 feet away and cling cling cling. The sound of change hitting the ground. We go back to the bridge, and there are 5 quarters laying directly in between the 2 yellow lines in the middle of the road. Thinking it was one of the other 4 people there messing with me, I came prepared. I then sign one of the quarters with my initials, and we all throw them back in the water. About 5 more minutes go by, and again I proclaim, "See, bullshit. It was one of you guys messing with us." We then proceed to walk back to the car, get about 10 feet away again. Cling cling cling. The sound of change hitting the ground again. We turn back around and see what it was. Sure enough, there were 5 quarters. Laying in the road. With one of them having my initials. In my handwriting. We are all going nuts and decide to run back to the car. After getting back to the car, we decide to keep going to see what else the road has to offer, but keep in mind, we're spooked from the change we just experienced. About 10 minutes go by, a few of us had to pee really bad, after holding it for the car ride, so we pulled up to this random castle-looking building, no bigger than a small house, but you could tell it was extremely old. We decided to just stop there because there was like a little indent in the road, to where a car can pull over. We all get out to go. I go to my immediate left and do my business. After I'm done, I notice my one friend is walking towards the castle, almost in a trance-like state. We yelled his name to come back, but he kept walking. We all ran up and grabbed him and shook him out of it. After questioning why the hell he'd be walking up there alone, he stated that he was following me and that I waved him to come here without saying a thing to him. The problem with that was the fact that the entire group was actually behind him. We had all sorts of signals as a group, so I would never just wave him to me without saying anything, so I'm 100% convinced that he saw a doppelganger leading him to trouble. The fear level is definitely higher now, so we decide to leave. Like I stated earlier, it's an extremely dark road in the woods, so you can't see much. You have to pass Dead Man's Curve twice, once on the way in and once on the way out. We're probably 4 miles away from the curve when we see headlights behind us. We didn't think much of it, as we thought it was just some other kids our age trying to do what we were doing. About a minute goes by after us talking about random stuff trying to ease the mood, and we noticed the headlights were directly behind us. The headlights looked super old, and you could tell it was a truck because of how high the lights were off the ground. The thing was, we didn't see a truck, just the lights, because it's so dark there. Getting more creeped out, we told the driver to speed up and try to get this crazy driver off of our tail, but he was sticking right on us, going around bends at high speeds, straightaways, everything. We couldn't shake him. The problem was that we were in a brand new, modified sports and performance car. If someone were to be driving an old truck, or any truck for that matter, there's absolutely no way that they would be able to keep up with us for more than 30 seconds, but this thing was on us for what seemed to be miles. Finally, about half a mile away from Dead Man's Curve, it's almost as if the lights shut off, and we lost it, so I remember pulling up right after the curve and pulling over so that we could find our way back to the main roads. Meanwhile, there's wood on both sides of us. We're all talking very lightly, just in case something crazy were to happen, we could hear it and be aware. 2 minutes go by, and after getting service to our phones, one of the guys got directions, so we were in the clear. Right before the driver put the car in drive, we hear this deafening screech, which sounded like a woman's scream, literally sounded about 20 feet away from us. So loud, I lost my hearing for a few minutes. When we looked over to where the noise came from, I will never ever forget what we saw. I know this is going to sound crazy. And if it didn't happen to me, I would never believe it. We saw a typical movie scene: white dress, black hair figure standing there, but next to that was a clown, hanging upside down from a tree, swinging back and forth, smiling at us, and moving its head in any direction we moved. The clown was like an old school type of clown from back in the day, like a sideshow creeper clown with a big circular neckline. I can't remember much detail about it, except for that damn circle neckline and chilling old school vibe. Now this totally could have been a prank, but to have set that prank up, you would have to have both immense patience for someone to come to that exact spot or balls of steel to be doing that in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. With just 2 people? Nah. I don't think I've ever been in a car that moved as fast as ours after that sitting. We then found the main road and headed back. Going home, we did research and found out about the legends of the ghost truck, Dead Man's Curve, etc. It was such a rush. By the time we got home, it was probably 2:30 in the morning, and we had already forgotten the feeling of how scared we actually were. So we all decided when we got home, let's do it again the next day, which would have been Sunday, to see who really had balls. We all parked at my friend's house so he could drive us, so we all had to drive ourselves home. I lived 15 minutes away, and on the way home, I noticed that a rundown church in my town had letters put up on their board. They never used it, so it was strange to see. The board stated, "You're going to need Jesus on Sunday." About a minute after passing that church, my radio cut out and started playing Bloody Sunday Sunday, Bloody Sunday. It's safe to say I made a call to the group saying we're not going back. It's been about 7 years, and I refuse to go there ever again. But that night made me believe. My dad's cousin, Jeremiah, lived in a rural area of Kansas. His lawn was mostly comprised of tall grass, and his family home was surrounded by the woods. He loved the woods, and as they had no television, toys, or anything, he loved to go there to collect wild berries and mushrooms. One of his favorite pastimes consisted of whittling sticks. He was quite the craftsman, and he made amazing things with wood and sticks. The woods were so deep that people and little kids were forbidden to go there without supervision or after sundown. But there were accidents, as people always love to do stuff that is forbidden. A few months ago, one of his neighbor's teenage sons went into the woods, and he never came back. They just couldn't find him. So, that day Jeremiah went a little deeper into a place from where he could see the edge of the forest. So he sat down and started to whittle sticks. He didn't notice the sun had set until some kind of liquid hit the back of his neck. He didn't mind much and continued to whittle his stick. Then he felt something fall on his forehead. He wiped at it, and his hand came away with blood. "What in the hell?" he whispered and looked up and around. He saw nothing out of the ordinary except all his hairs were standing on end, and he was covered with goosebumps. Suddenly, he became aware of something. He couldn't hear anything. Everything had become very quiet. There were no bird calls or insects to be heard. Then he heard it. Sounds of branches breaking and the crunching of dried leaves in the ground. He held his lantern up and looked around. He couldn't see anything, as the light from the lantern didn't penetrate the darkest corners around him. He decided to leave, and as he was packing his things up, suddenly he couldn't move. As he sat paralyzed, he could feel that something big was drawing closer to him. Then the thing stepped in front of him. His eyes grew wide and his throat dried up, as he never saw anything so unholy and terrifying in his whole life. And the worst part is, he knew who it was. It was the kid from the neighborhood, or at least his face, that was perched on a long, scaly, and withered neck. He, or whatever it was between 214 and 274 centimeters in height. Its body was hairy, and its hand was hairy, and they ended in huge curved claws, and its feet ended in hooves. There was something dangling from its mouth, which really looked like a human leg. But Jeremiah didn't want to accept it. Jeremiah tried to scream but no sound came out. He heard a raspy whisper in the wind, which sounded like "Go away, you are not welcome here." He tried to speak again but ended up farting. He lost consciousness as he saw the creature approaching him. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the porch of the house. He remembered a dream where that horrible creature told him why and how he ended up turning into that creature, what he did, and what he ate to survive lost in the forest. The truth was more unsavory and disturbing than he could have imagined. He decided to keep that kid's secret and take it to the grave, lest he and his family face the wrath of his damned spirit. He decided never to go into the woods again and stop anyone else from doing the same. I was a young, 18, backcountry guide in Yellowstone, back in the late 1970s. As you might imagine, it was a rich font of fun and adventure. For example, there was a frosty September morning when I unzipped my tent, to find a 3,000-pound bison grazing less than 10 feet away. Another morning, I played a nerve-wracking game of Ring Around the Rosie with a young bull moose, dodging around willow clumps until I guess he got bored with the prospect of stomping me to death. I still fear moose more than any other wild animal. Another time, up in Bachelor Canyon, I had eaten my fill of thimbleberries and lounged back in the thick bushes to relax. I was startled awake sometime later to the snuffling and rustling of some massive woodland creature. I lay hidden in the bushes in frozen silence until well after the sounds disappeared. A huge pile of berry-filled scat, which I found nearby, confirmed my close encounter with a grizzly bear. Over the several years I worked in the park, I saw and experienced so many wonderful animals. Megafauna like wolves, bighorn sheep, elk, mule deer, and black bears, to the smaller creatures like marten, coyotes, skunks, porcupines, badgers, and my personal favorite, the pika. Some of these are dangerous, but all of them are delightful. There really is nothing cuter than a bouncing baby buffalo. Google it, you're welcome. This story is about an animal encounter, but not with any of the animals mentioned above. Every week of the short Wyoming summer, I would guide a group of 8 to 10 people on backpacking excursions through various trails of Yellowstone. Usually our outings were 5 or 6 days, and we covered anywhere from 45 to 70 miles in that time. In the wilderness of Yellowstone, this meant that at our midpoint, we might be as much as 35 miles, and 3 river crossings, from the nearest road or ranger station. Many of the clients were city folk or backpacking novices, so it was quite an ambitious adventure for them. Consequently, they always required a little hand-holding and quite a lot of instruction and encouragement. There were a handful of other guides in our organization. It was standard practice for us to work in teams. I and my clients would start at one end of a trail, while another guide and his group would start at the other. We would pass at some point in the middle, have a long group lunch, and share trail notes. It was always a welcome opportunity to connect with another guide friend. On this particular week, my group had started right at Old Faithful Geyser. Our destination was the Bachelor Ranger Station, 60 miles away, on the southeast boundary of the park. Of course, this meant that the other group would be doing just the opposite, starting at Bachelor Station and ending their hike at Old Faithful. In between, Both groups would see dozens of astonishingly beautiful waterfalls, cross the Continental Divide a couple of times, enjoy world-class fishing, see some incredible, and rarely seen, thermal features, and, of course, see plenty of animals. If the weather wasn't terrible, and if nobody got lost or eaten, this trail was always a winner. One of my absolute favorites. My group was a cohesive group of fathers and sons who already knew each other. They were wonderful people, but definitely out of their element. They were city dwellers, and they were bargain travelers. None of that is particularly an issue for me, just an observation. I was worried that a couple of the boys were wearing vinyl shoes. You know the kind I'm talking about if you grew up in the 70s, Kmart specials made out of some ballistic PVC. They aren't great for hiking, but they make great blisters. Oh well, I'd rather have someone wear the shoes they are used to than wear a stiff new pair of boots. When we gathered round for a pack shakedown, it was less than ideal. One of the dads had about 15 pounds of camera gear, a huge SLR 35mm with all the extras. Beyond that, there was lots of cotton clothing, some really crappy rain gear, some sketchy aluminum framed packs, and way too many extras of everything. So, basically, it's the usual. In the 70s, backpacking was different. In a way, it was simpler and purer. Not many people had ultralight gear back then. Internal frame packs were a rarity. Compact liquid gas stoves were a novelty. In fact, it was almost more common to see army surplus than much specialized backpacking gear. I really wasn't concerned with this group. These guys seemed physically fit, and they all had positive attitudes. The weather looked good, and we had pared their pack weight down to respectable levels. It would be a great week. After Old Faithful erupted, right on time, we hit the trail. Within minutes we were surrounded by pines, and the traffic noises faded away. The hikers were chattering and horseplaying, but I knew a few miles in the sun would settle everyone down. We stopped at Lone Star Geyser and were lucky to catch another eruption. Not a great one, but a real treat considering that about 99.9% of park visitors will never even know this geyser exists. I prompted everyone to remember to drink, and then we hit the trail again. Our first camp wasn't really very far down the trail. So we arrived early and had plenty of time to cook a good meal, sort out sleeping gear, and get to know each other. Everyone slept well, and morale was not a problem. The next morning we climbed the Continental Divide and covered a lot of miles. There were the typical blisters, a few grouchy moments, and our first moose sighting. We lunched at Shoshone Geyser Basin, and I was gratified at the group's collective amazement at this place. A few of us swam in Shoshone Lake. Then we hiked on to camp number 2. The third day we hiked downhill into the head of Bachelor Canyon. The next 2 days would be a highlight: shady trails, scads of massive waterfalls, wild berries, and great fishing. After setting up our camp that evening, we hiked a mile back up the canyon to one of the few spots in Yellowstone where it is legal, or even advisable, to soak in natural thermal springs. The boys hurried ahead and apparently surprised a skinny dipping couple. As the poor woman scrambled to put on her swimsuit, the boys gallantly turned their backs. But not before getting an eyeful. Later in the week, I overheard one of the boys telling another, in whispered awe, of how beautiful the young lady was. Ah, puberty. Day 4 was the midpoint. On this day, we would meet the other group of hikers, headed the other way. If we timed it right, like we usually did, maybe we could meet by one of the major falls for a scenic lunch. Oddly, we passed both Iris and Colonnade Falls with no sight of the other party. I began to dread that they might have met with some emergency and been delayed. In the backcountry, emergencies are amplified by distance and communications. Especially in the 70s when, of course, there were no cell phones. On a previous trip, a client had a simple asthma attack, which would have been almost inconsequential in normal conditions. But, at high altitude, with limited medication, the man had nearly died of hypoxia. So, I was already on edge when we finally caught our first glimpse of the other group. It was already late in the day, and they were still miles from their next scheduled camp. It only got weirder after that. As the group came near, I noticed the guide, my friend, Mike, was hiking out in front. This is unusual, as the guide usually rides drag, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Clients love to be in front, and instead of the group being spread out a bit on the trail, which naturally occurs, the entire group could have been contained inside the length of a school bus. It looked so wrong. As they got closer, it was obvious that everyone in the party was quiet and subdued. In fact, they looked positively grim. I ran a quick inventory of what the hell might be going on. Have they had some sort of argument or fight? Had the crew mutinate on the guide? Had their group lost someone? Had someone been injured? In any case, the guide, Mike, and his whole group, were somehow stressed, pissed off, or something. Consequently, I held back from approaching my friend. So, rather than stepping forward to meet him, like I would ordinarily do, I held back. I would let Mike come to me whenever he felt like it. In any case, I called pack break for my crew, and they all shrugged off their packs and started rummaging for lunch and organizing water refills. They were a great crew, and they practically were running themselves by now. By now, Mike's crew had hiked past most of my guys, and he was drawing even with me as I was sitting on a down tree about 2 meters off the trail. Mike and his group were all still in that bizarre tight formation, so much closer together than people naturally hike. It was confusing the hell out of me. It was about that point when I began to think that Mike was going to hike right past me without even acknowledging me. What in the world was going on? My curiosity and alarm got the better of me, so I spoke up. I kept it short because I could see he was really stressed about something. I just said something simple like, "Hey Mike, everything okay?" Without skipping a beat, he turned and said quizzically, "Do I know you?" I was stunned and confused by his weird response. I was about to stammer back some reply when he said, "Oh right. We met on this trail last year." Then he flashed a weird fake smile, waved, and turned quickly around and kept walking. It happened so fast that he was 20 yards up the path. Obviously, he didn't want to talk to me. But why? I watched him to see if he gave any other clues. Nothing. I then scanned his small party to see what it could tell me. Nothing. At first. As they hiked around the bend and began to disappear into the trees, I noticed that one of the hikers had only a small day pack. What? And another hiker had no pack at all. I had almost missed it, as they were hiking so closely together. I was stumped. I was dumbfounded. Why didn't those guys have gear? Why wouldn't Mike acknowledge me? I thought for a moment to run after them. But what would I do? I didn't even know what was going on. It all seemed almost unreal as I watched my guys casually passing around food and filling canteens. They were subdued and quiet as well. I had told them we would have lunched together with Mike's crew when we found them. We had delayed lunch by nearly 2 hours. They wondered what was going on too. Eventually, one of the dads asked me if he could help. I told him about the weird exchange between me and Mike and then about the 2 hikers with no gear. As we talked about it, I guess a few theories started to crystallize. It struck me like a slap that Mike was somehow under duress. I felt a hollow sense of brief panic and almost took off running after him. But what would I do? I still didn't really know anything. If Mike was truly in trouble, the last thing I wanted to do was make it worse. As I and the other adult continued to desperately puzzle over the situation, we heard the thumping of a helicopter in the distance. The copter flew overhead at a fairly high altitude. I doubted it could even see us. I wondered if it was constrained by the high walls of the canyon or if it was just trying to be careful. By now, I felt fairly sure that it had something to do with Mike's crew. I didn't know if we should try to signal the helicopter, or if that would just cause confusion. In any case, I knew the helicopter would be unable to touch down anywhere around us, as the canyon is dense with old-growth trees and steep rocky walls for miles. In a moment the helicopter was past us, and it was all a mood issue. Still at a loss for what to do, and kind of out of a dumb sense of duty and normalcy, I just ended up calling the end of pack break, and we got back on the trail. Within 2 miles, we were out of the canyon and on the edge of Bachelor Meadows, a massive flat grassland that stretches for miles. We found our campsite and set up camp. Sick with worry and still miles away from Bachelor Ranger Station, I was doing a lot of anxious mental hand-wringing. I was torn between hiking out overnight to get help at the ranger station or hiking back up the canyon to help Mike, myself. I was reticent to leave my crew, in any case. I was honestly scared and confused. Before I could belabor the issue much longer, we saw 2 riders on horseback on the far edge of the meadow. They were covering ground fast. In a matter of minutes, they were at our camp. When I saw them up close, I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more worried. They were 2 park rangers armed, and both had rifles in their saddle scabbards. Before I could say anything, the rangers simply told us to pack up and head south. When I asked why, they told me they had fugitives in the area, and we were to abort our trip plans. Naturally, everything cleared up for me in an instant. I quickly told the rangers what had occurred with Mike's party when we had passed them in the canyon. I told the rangers about the 2 men with no gear. I was able to give the rangers details about what the men were wearing and let them know what Mike looked like, too. I was even able to tell them that Mike's group was scheduled for campsite 9D1 that night, 3 Rivers Junction. At that point, the ranger canceled our evacuation order. With the solid information about where the fugitives were and with positive IDs, the ranger felt we were no longer in immediate danger. Straight away, the rangers rode into the canyon. It was a nervous evening and a long night. When morning came, we broke camp and started the hike across the long grassy meadows. I was hopeful that Mike was already safe, but I had no way of knowing. I made the decision to cancel the last leg of our hike in order to get to the Bachelor Ranger Station one day earlier. I wanted an update as soon as possible. It would mean we would forego seeing Union Falls, which is arguably the highlight of the trip, but there is no way I could have waited any longer to find out if Mike was safe. We got to the ranger station a bit past noon. I had dragged my poor clients past some of the best fishing in the world. We had blown past Cave Falls and Dononda Falls. But graciously, the clients were cool about it. By now, they were all in the picture, and they were very understanding. The minute we got to Bachelor Station, we're fortunate to find a talkative ranger, and we got all the details. The two rangers, who had ridden past us the day before, had already radioed in with the resolution. Mike was safe. All of his crew were safe. The fugitives were in custody and had been taken out to the road at Shoshone Lake. The duty ranger was good enough to tell us how things had gone down. The fugitives were two young adults from the Idaho Juvenile Correction Academy over in St. Anthony, Idaho. In Idaho, individuals up to 21st of May be retained in the juvenile system. The men had assaulted staff and escaped with a stolen vehicle. They had traveled the 30-mile-long dirt road between Idaho and Flag Ranch on the park's south boundary. They had ditched the car after dragging the oil pan out and hiked into the park. They had overtaken Mike's group at their campsite in Bachelor Meadows. Obviously, when they passed us, they were holding the group by threat. One fugitive had a large knife, which he had brandished, and the other claimed to have one, too. They controlled the group by positioning one man right behind Mike and the other at the end of the column. They kept the group very tight together. With the information I had provided, the two rangers had actually beaten Mike's group to their next camp. They had taken their horses on the far side of the river, on the equestrian trail, and had been hidden and waiting by the time Mike and his crew arrived to set up camp. Prudently, the rangers had waited until the party had bedded down for the night before moving in for a quick and simple arrest. One of the fugitives had been standing guard, while the other was curled up in a ground tarp, which they had taken from Mike. After the arrest, Mike was a pro. He and his crew finished the week-long hike. What else could they do? They were 25 mics from anything. He said it was probably the best thing for everybody because they all had a couple of days of solitude to process the traumatic situation together. He said by the end they were joking about it, and it seemed like an integral part of their great adventure. By the time they got to Old Faithful, they were all friends for life. Mike did tell me that when the helicopter had flown over that day, the guy with the day pack had freaked out and ordered everyone to get under cover of the tree canopy. Mike says the man held him by the back of his belt with the knife resting against his kidneys until the helicopter was gone. As for me, I thanked Mike for his quick thinking and acting like we were strangers. I apologized for almost blowing his cover. Obviously, his sharp wits and selflessness prevented my whole group from getting tangled up with the fugitives, too. Who knows what the men might have done if they found out we were together. My group ended up having a good week, too. We left the trail a day early, but they had certainly gotten their money's worth. If you're ever in Yellowstone, keep an eye peeled for dangerous animals. Including the tail-legged ones. Okay, so I live in South Africa, Limpopo, and this story took place on my game farm. It was in October 2015, and me and two of my friends, who we'll call N and M, planned to go to the far end of my farm on horseback. We took one tent and about 3 days worth of food. We also took a compound bow and a 375, this will come in handy later. The first night was perfectly fine, beginning with us hunting a few kudu and skinning them to dry out overnight. The next day we saw some footprints, if I can even call it that, but we blew it off as an animal being curious about what was happening at our camp. At about 8 p.m. at night, we stoked the fire to a huge bonfire and cut up some meat and cooked it on the fire. Then it began. We heard footsteps in the far end of the camp and deer calls throwing it off as a buck coming into our camp. We all still just stood around the fire. The main horse, Black Mamba, began to get uneasy. I told them it could maybe be him just getting frustrated over being hooked up to a tree for 2 days. Then we saw it. It had the head of a kudu and the legs as well. My friend called out what the duck is that we all just backed away slowly, and every step we gave, the thing passed one closer to us, looking at us as if we were one of its next meals. I thought of how this might be our end, but then I remembered I put my 375 next to my tent. I told my friend he should give it to me so I could fire a warning shot at it. The moment I spoke, it began to growl at us. At that moment, I didn't know what to do, so I shot the thing right in the shoulder. I will never forget the scream that thing let out. It sounded like a lion roaring and a hyena laughing. We booked it out of there, leaving the kudus that we shot in our tent, only grabbing the gun and bow and riding away to my house. From that day on, I always felt like I'm being watched when I'm out on the farm putting out feed. The Maine hunting trip. It rained yesterday, and I couldn't help but be reminded of the events of 2 years ago. I go deer hunting in Maine every chance I can get and decided to spend a few days out. Good thing I kept a journal so I can share the events of the trip as I experienced them. October 1st, 2015. It feels good to get away from the house for a while. Been too busy for too long. Now I can do things at my own pace. I spotted a few deer tracks near the creek early in the morning. They seem a little dry, so they're probably not too fresh. I'll just keep moving to my campsite. The shelter is still up. It's also in surprisingly good condition. I built it months ago, in preparation for hunting season. Seems to only need minor work. Supper consisted of rice with onions and jalapenos along with a nice piece of chicken breast cooked on the fire. Absolutely delicious. Nothing significant happened today as I was settling in. But that's okay. Tomorrow will be a long day, for sure. Lots of scouting around. October 2nd, 2015. It got a bit cold last night. Luckily, I was prepared. My wool blanket was adequate. I heard something scurrying around the camp at random times throughout the night. Probably a damn raccoon looking for some scraps. Luckily, I'm not a messy eater and didn't drop anything or leave anything out. The sky has turned a dark blue. Better get moving. I'm sitting up against a big pine tree, and I must say, this thing is large. I'm 6 feet tall with a wide build, and my shoulders don't even come close to the sides of this tree. It's oddly quiet. No birds, chipmunks, or squirrels running around. Odd. They must know some bad weather is coming in. The shadows are getting long, so it would be in my best interest to head back to camp. That spot was comfortable, but I pretty much saw nothing. Won't be back there tomorrow. Made it back to camp. Time to cook supper. I'll keep it simple tonight. I've been snacking on beef jerky all day, so I'm not too hungry. Just a simple biscuit, rice, and a cup of peppermint tea. Nothing fancy. October 3rd, 2015. I heard a strange sound last night. Kind of reminded me of a big bass drum. I figure a tree must have fallen down, but the wind doesn't seem strong enough to do that. I'm at a new spot. I saw a deer walk by, but his antlers were very small, and he wasn't even in my bow range. But that said hunting. Just gotta wait. A few hours passed, but I'm not too sure how many. It's later in the day, but still plenty of light out. I smell smoke. Other hunters are probably scaring away my deer. I doubt it, but it's still something to think about. I saw someone in the distance. He didn't seem to notice me, though. Good thing I'm wearing greens and browns. I would have been irritated if he came up to talk to me. No other deer besides that one from earlier. Clouds are getting dark. Wind picking up. Better head back to camp. I'm back at camp. The wood pile is dwindling, so I should get some. It's almost too dark to see now. Be back soon. I walked a little too far. Stupid me. I had a sturdy arm full of wood, though. Luckily, I knew where camp was. That could have been bad. I heard that loud bass sound again. More than once this time. I'll check it out in the morning. October 4th, 2015. It started raining last night, which is great. Nothing too heavy, but certainly enough to make me and any what I might need to collect wet. I was exhausted when I got back. I forgot to eat. I'm going to make up for that right now. Oatmeal with apples and cinnamon with beef jerky and tea. Yummy. Breakfast was good. I'm going to see if I can find where that noise was coming from. There seems to be a big tarp of some kind hanging up on a tree. I wouldn't have noticed it if it wasn't for the wind whipping it around. There's lots of holes in it. Must be old. I saw the same person again, far off. But this time I think he saw me. Actually, now that I think about it, he did see me. Why else would he be facing my direction? I got a little creeped out and walked away. The guy didn't even wave at me like hunters sometimes do. I wonder if he was hearing the noises, too. Nothing too interesting today. Gonna eat and go to bed. Night night. The noise woke me up. This is irritating. It's not even morning yet. Gonna try to get back to sleep. Okay, something's up. I recently heard someone scream like an Apache warrior. Nor going to be able to fall asleep after that. I'm scared. My knife and tomahawk are next to me, and my bow is strung and waiting for danger. I'm going to leave tomorrow, screw this. October 5th, 2015. I spent hours awake last night. I might have overreacted, but that noise was terrifying. I haven't left the shelter yet. I'm too scared to go outside. I have to go to the bathroom, but I don't want to go outside. Okay, I can't hold it anymore, my bladder is about to erupt. There's a knife stuck in the tree right next to my shelter. Jesus Christ. I don't think I overreacted at all. I'm out of here. That was the last entry in my journal. But that's not where this story ends. I started packing my things up when I noticed that the guy was there again. I knew he was up to no good the second I saw him then and there. Why else would he be staring at me? Why else was there the knife in the tree? I just ran. A lot of my stuff got left behind too, but luckily I had my knife and tomahawk with me. The journal was stuffed in my bag, and some of the pages were crinkled. Anyway, I ran and ran. My lungs surely were going to collapse if I didn't stop. I fell to the floor, gasping and panting like a dog. Not knowing where to run, I just kept moving as fast and silently as possible. Unfortunately, it started getting dark, and either I can run around in the dark like a chicken with its head cut off, or I could sit up against a tree and wait for morning. Either choice could have meant death, but I'd rather not have a broken ankle and have to fight a crazy guy. So my choice was made. I was going to sit against the tree. I wish I could say nothing happened, but that's not how these stories seem to end. I smelled smoke at this point. Very, very, very pungent. It smelled like burning tires and meat. Very disgusting. I could hear chanting of some sort. And that sounds. The sound I've been hearing. It was more intense than it has been during the whole trip. It sounded like someone was slamming a sledgehammer into it, a bass drum, with a quicker pace than ever. I knew I couldn't stick around. As I stood to sneak away, I heard someone walking around, and I saw the beam of a flashlight. I knew I was screwed. He wasn't too far from me at that point, which scared me because I didn't see or hear him until that point. He must have knew I was there or something. So I started sneaking away, and then all of a sudden, snap. I snapped a damn stick. I knew that he knew where I was now. He let out that call. The war cry sound that I heard before. Then all of a sudden, I heard multiple men making that sound. Of course I ran. There was no hiding at this point. I could hear at least 10 other guys in hot pursuit. At this point, I accepted my death. I understood it was the end, and there was nothing I could do. 10-1. Who knew what weapons they had? Guns? Knives? I didn't want to know. They were catching up to me. The ground was muddy as hell. As I was running, I noticed that I was very close to a steep hill. And I mean dangerously close. I slipped down the hill. Flipping and sliding for what seemed like ever. I'm sure it was 10 or 15 seconds, but still. I must have passed out for some time because I woke up to the sky turning that dark blue that indicates the morning is near. Nothing was broken. I still don't know how. My tomahawk was missing, but my knife was still on my belt. I stood up. Bruised and sore as hell. Why didn't they kill me? How did I survive? Maybe they were chasing me away from what they were doing. To this day, I will never know. There was a trail about 100 yards away. I'm glad I found it. I knew it would take me out of there. I just didn't know how long it would take. I followed the trail for a few hours. Probably would have been quicker had I not fallen down the hill. Anyway, I kept walking, and I eventually made it to a parking lot. There was a father and his son taking their fishing rods out of the bed of a pickup. They stared at me like I was a damn creature. The dad said I looked like hell. I'm sure everyone went through that. I looked at my reflection in the window of the truck and was shocked. He asked me if I needed a ride, and I of course said, yes, take me to the hospital. After a couple of days. It probably wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done, but I just had to know what was going on there. It's been a few years since I stepped foot in that forest. Who were those men? What were they doing here? I was going to find out. I just had to go back. I wanted to see if all my gear was there, but I was mostly interested in getting clues as to what happened. Believe it or not, the trip to the camp was uneventful. Sure, it was tiring because of all the snow, even with snowshoes, but there was no one following me or trying to kill me. And I sure was thankful. Anyways, I made it to my camp and saw the knife still stuck in the tree, but my shelter was completely leveled. Kind of disappointing considering all the work it took putting it up. But I also noticed footprints in the snow. They were deep, and I could tell they were old because they were slightly filled in with snow and the edges were rounded off. Now at this point, my heart was beating a little faster, but I took comfort in the fact that I brought some weapons. Not weapons for a hunt, but for my very protection. I lost my bow and a lot of gear last time I was here, so I didn't have anything that can shoot anyone. I don't have a gun. Instead, I brought my hunting knife and a native war club. I'm heavily into the native culture. That might seem stupid to most people, and it is. What if they had guns? But hey, I don't have a gun. Since the tracks were old and I had weapons, I settled down a bit but kept my guard up. It was nearing sunset, so I decided to hunker down in a thicket of rhododendron. The night air was chilly, but nothing I couldn't tolerate. Aside from that, I had a good wool blanket and a small fire. And when I say small, I mean very small. Only burning thin branches will produce little to no smoke. Sleep was the last thing on my mind. For obvious reasons. I only rested my eyes for a few minutes here and there until the sun was up. The sun started coming up, turning the sky into that dark blue color. I knew I had to start moving, but first I needed a light breakfast for some energy. The granola bars I prepared went down nicely. Time to move. The snow was hard on top, so I could strap my snowshoes onto my pack. It must have been colder than I thought last night. I started moving in the direction I ran to last time. I don't know if the birds and squirrels sense something is off or if they're hunkered down for winter. I was beginning to be unsettled. Usually there's at least a squirrel digging into the snow to find an acorn it buried. But not even a track from them. My mind was beginning to race. I'm sure it's only because of the cold weather. It has to be. I pushed on a little longer and decided to take a break and eat another granola bar or two. My damn water bottle froze, so I dug past the hard layer of snow and got to the soft stuff and ate a mouthful. Break over. I felt like I was walking for at least 2 hours, so the spot where I heard the men should be close. There's no way I ran this far. However, adrenaline is a hell of a thing. That's when I heard men talking. Not too close, but definitely a lot closer than I was comfortable with. Please just be hikers, please just be hikers, I repeated in my mind 1,000 times. There was a huge downed pine tree that would make good cover. I sat down behind it and made sure my weapons were ready to pull out fast if need be. The voices got closer and closer before they just stopped, and that scared me. I doubt they could see my tracks. I barely punched through the snow. It's really hard and able to support my weight. The voices picked up again, but I don't think they were speaking English. I honestly don't know what language it was. French maybe? Canada isn't too far away. It is Maine after all. That's when I heard more voices behind me. My heart sank. I had to lay as close to the ground as possible, and it sure was cold. I was shivering in no time. Fear and the cold will do it to you. The two groups of men met up about 200 to 300 feet from where I was based on how their voices sounded. Now there were at least 4 of them. Out of nowhere, all 4 of them let out that loud war cry. Whatever the reason, I have no clue. Here's where something happens that I regret. I poked my head up to look where they were, and I must have been spotted. I heard one of the men shout, "Hey!" I must have poked my head out too far. Stupid of me considering I can sneak up on deer and not some crazy cult member. I took my club off of my back and held it firm, yet not too hard so I wouldn't fatigue too easily. My knife was in my other hand. The men charged towards me but stopped when they saw I was armed. I'm guessing they had no weapons, as I saw one pick up a pretty thin, rotten branch. I began to scream at them and ask who they were and what they were doing out here. They just stared with the look of hatred on their faces. "If I were you, I would leave as soon as possible," one of the men said to me. I asked them why they wouldn't answer me. "Leave now," the man shouted at me. I started backing up, and they began grinning at me. The look on their faces will never leave me. Hatred, malice, and excitement all in one stare. They looked like they wanted to cook me. That's when one of them charged me. It happened too fast. I slammed my club onto the bridge of his nose. He fell like a stone. 2 more of them ran towards me, while one checked on the other guy. One guy approached from my right side with a knife and managed to swipe my kneecap before I hit his back with the club as hard as I could. The other one stopped in his tracks. He looked slightly scared. I'm sure I looked scared, too. But I had just dropped 2 of his friends. They were lying on the floor in pain. "Leave right now, Brian." My mouth became dry. My knees shook. How did I know my name? I certainly didn't tell him. "How do you know my name?" I asked in shock. "When my scout chased you out of here, you left your wallet in a rush." He and the other man that was seeing if his friends were okay suddenly started laughing the most evil laugh. "It had your ID with all your information in it. Expect to see us soon, Brian." They cackled the most wretched cackle. Out of fear, I ran as fast as I could despite having an injured knee. Luckily they weren't following me, and I know that because I could hear their wicked cackle behind me as I stumbled out of there. After about 10 minutes of what can be described as a limp/jog, I couldn't hear them anymore. I stopped to bandage my knee as quick as possible. The pain wasn't too bad as long as I didn't put my full weight on it. The adrenaline wore off a while ago. Limping and slipping, I finally made it to my original camp. But it would be stupid to camp here for more than one reason. So I kept moving. After not too long, I made it to the Jeep and drove home. I inspected my knee and found that it was very deep. It required stitches, so I went to the hospital. I have a picture, but I don't know how to put it here. Let me know how I can. It's been 2 weeks since then and still no sign on them. I still have no clue what is going on out there, and I will never go back to find out. But one thing is for sure, I can either move or get a shotgun. I will update if anything happens.